Interesting. As soon as I started the stream, I started getting this USB clock noise. So let me unplug a cable real quick. I have a point to make with this. It'll become apparent in a moment. But interestingly, until I started the stream, there was no clock noise from the USB connections. So I'll sort that out. Before we get into the chat and answering questions, and thank you for everyone who's here. Hope you're all having a good day. I've been building a little pedal board for use on the channel. I have a promise that I won't be going crazy with it. But, you know, like I'm plugged into this 58 Bassman, and the volume is just barely on. If I turn it down a little bit, it goes away. Sounds okay. A lot of guys like to hear everything with the reverb. So what if I put on a little spring reverb? That's cool. It can be a little much for some things. Let me go to a different thing. So here I can have just a little bit of plate reverb. Maybe add a real subtle tape echo. Make it go longer. Go to slapback. Feet's too big. There's like a Robin Ford kind of slapback. What if I wanted to add a little bit of gain to it? Here's a clon. Here's a Zen drive. Here's both. And then it goes off. But let me show you what I promise you I will not be doing. Which is what I see on almost every channel that has pedal boards, especially channels where the pedal boards have modelers. They'll say things like, hey, welcome to my YouTube guitar channel. Let me show you the basic sound. This is with my always on pedals, and here's my clean sound. So I think it's a lot better just to keep it kind of basic, so you can actually always hear what the amps are. Here's just little deluxe memory man. So that's about the extent of what I plan to be doing with pedals in amp demos. Though I won't be using it very often, it's just nice to have it available from time to time. So let me get up to the beginning of the chat and start the part that you're all actually here for. But I wanted to get this information out about the pedal boards, and I didn't think it was worth doing a standalone video for, so I thought I'd just talk about it here. Hey, Sebastian, I'll try to dial back the German jokes. Let's just talk about the Austrians, right? Let's see. Murph Vienna 1. I might have just sunk myself talking about Austria there. Let's see. So he had the high watt full service question. I don't actually remember that question. Sorry. Let's see. But he had the 5 can caps changed, the bias pot added. I think you'll probably be in a great shape. It's such a good amp at its core. High watts in general up to about 1980, and then they vary so much after that. Let's see. Hey, John. Bandmasters and Tremoluxes are fantastic. Really fantastic choices. There's not a lot of difference between the black panel Tremolux and Bandmaster. Pretty much just tube rectification versus solid state. The Bassmans can be tricky. The AB165 is the most common model, and in stock form they are extremely noisy. The flip side of that is they have a lot more gain than the other 60s Fender black panel amps. So you may fall in love with that. And I've got a lot of videos showing how to keep the gain of the AB165 while lowering the noise by going to the AA864 output section. But, as I just showed, I don't know how it came across here. I won't know till I'll hear this back. That was not a separate mic on the cab, by the way. That was the Bassman here being picked up by this. So I wasn't trying to get the best fidelity, just let you hear it a little bit. Hopefully it'll be all right when I hear it back. Just a couple overdrives can really push a clean amp in any direction you want. So it's fine if you just go with the Vibrolux. It's fine if you just go with the Bandmaster and use a lot of pedals. It is a time-honored tradition. Let's see. Some of the earliest questions are appearing on my version of the chat out of order. So let me make sense of John Ratham's sequence. Okay, I think I got it. Hey, John. John's chasing a noisy reverb return on a 64 Deluxe Reverb. It appears only with the reverb pot up, no change with V3 and tank removed and V4 swapped. So it must be after the tank and before the pot. Yeah. He's thinking it's the 33 microfarad, sorry, 30, it's actually it's a 3.3 nanofarad, not a 33 nanofarad. So it's not 0.033, it's a 0.0033. Ceramic coupling cap. But it could also be the grid stopper 220K from the RCA jack to ground, or could it be? Any other options? Well, it's pretty simple to find out. Put the reverb pot about halfway up and get a wire with one end connected to ground. And be very careful while you do this because you need to have the amp on. So you have 3 connections on that reverb pot. One connection is ground. That'll be, if you're looking at the amp from the rear, so you're looking at the pots from up top and with the knobs facing away from you, the leftmost connection on that pot is to ground. The rightmost connection is coming from that 3.3 nanofarad coupling cap, and the center connection, the wiper, is what is going to the mixer recovery stage. If you were to take that wire that I mentioned, just a wire, or you can use a screwdriver, a metal screwdriver with a plastic handle, and touch the chassis right by the pot, and at the same time touch the center of the wiper of that pot, you should have no hum or any other signal coming out of that reverb. But if you touch the one on the right, which is the feed from that cap, you won't have any reverb, but you may still have hum. If you're touching, that'll tell you if it's if you touch the input, the one on the right coming from that cap, and that's grounded out and all the hum goes away, it might be that cap. You can also measure for DC. But a lot of times when you have noise in such a circuit, you can touch that and you still have hum, you just don't have any reverb there anymore because you've grounded out the send from that cap. That'll tell you if it's that cap or not. It could also be the 470K in the mixer, could be the 220K in the mixer. It'd be rare for it to be the 220K to ground off the RCA pot because that's in parallel with the tank when the tank is connected. So let me look through your question. Tank removed. You're going to have hum if the tank is removed. So you have to have a tank in place for you not to have hum. So you could have a bad tank. So first of all, grab another tank. See if it's a tank, because that's much more common cause of hum than anything in the reverb recovery stage. But if you want to see if it's that 3.3 nanofarad cap, grounding out the input of that pot is the way to do it. Just 1 second. How is my phone ringing? I have it in airplane mode and do not disturb. It's my son. I'll call him back. Sorry. If you see this, kiddo, I will call you back, but let's see. How is he reaching me? I've got my cell connection turned off. All right, airplane mode. Maybe that does a trick. Sorry about that, guys. And kiddo, if you're watching this and it's urgent, call Nikki and she'll get me. But I think you'll probably be okay for a few hours. Anyway, let's go here. Busker 24, our older JCM 800 2203 reissue is a good purchase. Thinking of buying one. The older ones and the newer ones are both potentially good purchases. The issue with any of the Marshall reissues is the 2203, 2204, 87, and 59 is that they have a heater network, a heater balance network, which burns, and it burns a lot. And they have 200 ohm resistors, two 100 ohm resistors. And if you look at the board over by the output tubes, on the board you'll see two turrets, and then two resistors, and then a square blue trim pot, and on the other side of that trim pot, another turret. And each turret is connected to the heater wire, and then the signal goes through those wires, through those 100 ohm resistors, to that blue trim pot, which then you adjust the balance, and the other side of that blue trim pot goes to ground, which is made at that turret right there. So you have two turrets down at the bottom where the heaters are coming in, and one turret up here. And that blue trim pot fails because it's rated for 1/3 of a watt, and it cannot handle the current there. The fix is to snip out the 200 ohm resistors that are mounted to the board, and then mount two new, longer 100 ohm half watt resistors from each turret coming in to the ground turret, and that cap can, that square trim pot can stay on the board. It's just not connected to anything anymore. That's the number one issue. The number two issue, and this primarily affects the older reissues, is that the power transformers Marshall was using in the 90s on that series and a lot of other amps, and this also includes to the Korg-made AC30 TB TBX amps. Those power transformers transformers, I almost said transistors. Those transformers tend to make a lot of noise over time, and sometimes you can tighten everything up, the bell cover and all the hardware, and the buzz and the noise goes away. But a lot of times in my experience, they need to be changed out. For whatever reason, they just start to emit a noise field, which gets picked up typically at the input of the phase inverter, and then it just gets added to your signal. And the only fix is to change out the transformer. But that's all that said, it is a good amp. I would not pay a premium for one, but if you get one used in pretty good condition, it can be made great. Hey, Rama Lama Ding Dong. Best blackface amp of 60s Fender-owned era and why? Fender-owned era, so pre-CBS. Princeton, Vibrolux, Super Reverb, Tremolux. Mid-60s is what I'm thinking of. Thanks, man. Well, my favorite two are the Vibrolux and the Super Reverb. Super Reverb is just a thing of glorious, very loud beauty with one of the best low ends of any amplifier ever. But large, heavy, very loud. Vibrolux gets my nod over the Deluxe Reverb because it's not much bigger, it's not much louder, but it has a little bit more of a unique character to my ears. It breaks up in a way unique among the Fender models of that time. Listen to Roy Buchanan to hear it used to the utmost. It just has a fantastic character, but it'll still do the Deluxe Reverb things. And if you have a Deluxe Reverb, you don't have to sell it to get a Vibrolux. There's some overlap between those two models, but of the relatively small ones, the 22-watt deluxe reverb versus the 28, 30-watt Vibrolux. I like the Vibrolux, and the 2x10s really do sound fantastic when they have good speakers. I'm not a big fan of the Utahs, but you can there are a lot of good sounding attended speakers which make those amps so full and 3D and vibrant. And the Princeton is an amp that everyone should experience, but it's not giggable for every genre unless you have a very expensive sound system. If you're using in-ears, you can use almost anything. It's a growing thing where the amplifier does not need to primarily be an amplifier anymore. It needs to be a tone generator, a tone shaper. And if you're sending a mic to front of house and everyone's got in-ears or very, very good monitors, there's a certain price point of PA that not every player gets to experience, then a Princeton can do anything. A Princeton can do Madison Square Garden. But if for those of us who have to bring their amp in and set it on a milk crate, and that's what the crowd is primarily hearing, because pretty much the only vocals are in the monitors, and the only vocals are really going to front of house, Princeton won't serve you well unless you're doing pretty much jazz. So there are in-betweens. Those are the two extremes. So Princetons are great, but I personally would rather keep a Vibrolux on 2 than have a Princeton on 8. That's me. Hello to everyone saying hello. Thank you very much, Surge98. That's very kind of you. He needs Fender style power and output transformers for 100 watt 6L6 dumble build. Would I go with Hammond, Haybor, Eggcore, or something else? I would not go with Eggcore because I have no experience of their sound or quality or long-term reliability. I know that they're very inexpensive. Of that list, I would seek first from Haybor to see if they have something suitable in stock. Beyond that, you could look into Hammond. Hammond has a lot of very good options. Mercury, I can use Mercury because I get very good prices from Mercury. But if you're an in buyer, doing a one-off purchase, I don't think it's worthwhile to the most people, unless you just want to have bragging rights. They are well built. They're very well built, and they sound very good. But I think for most people doing what you're doing, Hammond and Haybor would be the choices, with Haybor getting my particular nod of approval in that case. But if you end up, for whatever reason, needing to use Hammonds because of the specs that are and what's available, there's no shame in Hammond. Hammonds can be great. Hey, Green Calx, that was not the Royer. Most of the time lately when you hear amps on the channel, it is the Royer. This was this SM57 aimed this way, and the 58 Bassman's right down there aimed this way. So you're pretty much just hearing the Bassman just above 2, room sound. I have no idea how it's going to sound on playback until I hear it, but I know that I knew that you'd be able to hear enough for me to make my point about the pedal board. Hey, Danielle, any idea how that Casino compares to a Gibson ES330? I enjoy the sound of Grant Green. Yeah, enjoy the sound Grant Green guy with that style guitar. Well, this Casino, after a lot of upgrades, compares very favorably with most ES330s. The Casino in stock form does not. I've got a video showing everything I did. I changed out the bridge, I changed out the bridge mounting hardware, the pots, the caps, all the wiring, and more critically, I almost made a new word, critically, the P90s, because the stock P90s were really high in output, really dark, and unpleasant. And these are the Fralins, which just sound as they ought. Turn off that delay. I guess if I roll the tone back. a good jazz player could take this guitar and go do a Grant Green kind of gig, and everyone would say, that sounds great. And it would play great. But, you know, it's probably $600 to put into a $700 guitar to get it there. I didn't spend that because I did the work myself, and I didn't charge myself. And I didn't get the guitar for $700 because I had a unique opportunity through what I do. There are other P90 equipped guitars which could get you there faster. My friend Joe Restivo just got a beautiful, I think it's a 61 or 62 ES330. And he's going to bring it over here, and he's going to do a comparison. We're going to do a comparison between that original 60s ES330 and this, and my 335. But Joe's 330 is a particularly great example, and so it's unfair to any made in Korea guitar or made in China guitar to compare it to his particular ES330. But because we're perverse, we're going to do it. But yeah, the stock casinos out there won't do that. If you're really serious, one of the options is to look into the elitist line from 10 years ago, and the inspired by Lennon ones are really pretty good. Those had US P90s as well. So the inspired by John Lennon casino is a big step in the right direction. The elitist series are fantastic, but the prices have gone way up. Not as much as the limited edition John Lennon Revolution and 65s. So those things are like $3,000 to $5,000 now. But you could get a new 330 for less than that. But I don't know. That's the trouble with Gibsons is you can play one, it's fantastic. You play another one, it's just a dog, and the others that you play are just kind of meh. You know, the cream rises, but there's no predictability to it. Thoughts on Musicmaster bass amps for guitar? Circuit-wise, what is it similar to? It's an AB763 circuit, pretty much, without tremolo or reverb. So, you know, it is the normal channel of any 60s amp or 70s amp, and it's a good thing. It's kind of got, depending on which version of it, because I think there are a couple different ones, it's a little cleaner than most. And I think that one, is that the one that has the interstage transformer instead of a phase inverter? It's fine. It's not worth a lot because it's not as desirable, but there's nothing inherently wrong with it. If you can play and that amp is in good shape, you can get very good sounds with it. I'm not saying if you can play, like if you, Kevin, could play. You know, I'm saying in general. I wasn't singling you out. For all I know, you're a monster. Thank you, Gerben Luhus. I'm probably butchering your name, sorry. But greetings to you as well. Is it Luhi? Luhi? I'm wanting to go French because of the ending, but I never know. Speaking of old Musicmaster bass amps, Tonius Clay's old bass amp, Musicmaster decided to quit making noise one day. He changed the tube, and upon changing and powering it on, began arcing at the tube socket, and it melted it. Any ideas? Yeah, take it to a tech. You might have installed a tube wrong. Might have had a broken center locating pin, and so what was supposed to be the cathode was connected to the heater, and what was supposed to be the heater was connected to the plate, and vice versa. The good news is, let's say you fried the components there at the tube sockets, and you burnt the tube sockets. Well, new tube sockets are $3 each. The resistors on a tube socket there are maybe $1.50, $2 total. A good tech can put that back to life. Hopefully the mains fuse tripped and no other damage would happen to the amp, but I can't tell you that unless I looked at it. But do not feed any other tubes to that. They will be sacrificial tubes. Do not even power that amp on. Take it to a tech. Find out what happened. They can undo it. Hey, Martin, good to see you. I have no opinions on Rift amps yet. I have been watching his channel a bit as I have time. I don't watch a lot of amp channels. That's my day gig. And so, at the end of the day, I'd rather find out about other stuff, other things. But I do keep up with people doing what I do just out of curiosity about how they approach things, and to get a sense when people start talking about a certain person in this field, whether it's amp repair like I do, or pedal reviews or whatever. If enough people talk about it, I check it out. And a lot of times I watch the videos just to see how they present information or how their lighting is. I did like the laziest lighting of all time today, just the one light today. I have a lot of other things going on, but from what I've seen of his channel, he really knows his stuff, and his build quality seems to follow all the same precepts that I am constantly preaching. So I imagine his amps sound and operate very, very well. But until I have one on the bench, I can't tell you for sure. But I would think it would be a very safe bet that his amps are fantastic. With anything like that, there's the objective, which is all I can review for you, and the subjective. It may be a fantastic amp that is someone else's fantastic amp. When you play it, you may say, that's really good, but it doesn't speak to me. Like every Paul Reed Smith guitar I've played, almost every one of them has been a great guitar. So far, every one of those great guitars have clearly been someone else's great guitar. I have not bonded with one, but I cannot criticize anything about them. They just don't work for me. Hey, Travis. Thank you, Tom. Tom K1TL. That's a really hard name to try to pronounce. Let's see here. Hey, Skeeter Buck. When building a new amp and cloning an older Fender with 6 diodes or a Marshall with 4 diodes in the solid-state rectification, can you use only 2 diodes instead of the 6 or 4? You could, but I don't recommend it. Couple of reasons. Number one, Fender used 6 let's take a look at the Twin, because the diodes that Fender used were not rated for that much current or that much voltage, so they needed 3 in series per side to handle it. So on a Twin, yeah, you could use 2 1N4007s, which are 1 amps each and 1,000 volts each. You could use, you could probably use 2 of the 5 amp ones if you wanted to as well. Yeah, same thing for Marshalls, the same reason. But given how inexpensive diodes are today versus in the 60s, and how good they are, and how people will be surprised the voltage spikes which can occur in the rectification circuit, it makes sense to me to have that little bit of overkill built in. 3 1N4007s per side for a Twin, so 6 total, or 4 making a bridge for the Marshall. Marshall, see, it's tricky in a Marshall, because Marshall with 4 diodes in the solid-state rectification, that's usually a full wave bridge, so it's going positive and negative, and then there's a center tap thing. I don't want to get into that too much. Go to Merlin Blinco's site, valvewizard.co.uk, to fully understand that. The only better version of the Marshall 100-watt amp rectification typically would be to go to, say, a 6 or 8 amp rectifier bolted to the chassis rather than using discrete diodes. But as diodes are so cheap, go ahead and use all 6. You won't hurt anything. You will never regret having used 6. You're going to lose a volt of your potential B+. No big deal. But you might benefit from having more current and voltage capability than is needed. You will never benefit from having less capability than turns out to be needed. There are other diode series which have more than 1,000 volts handling, which handle more than 1 amp, and you could use just one of those per side on a Twin. But given cost, availability, and size, there's no reason not to use the 3 1 in 4,007s. Hey, James Underhill, thinking of buying a DSL 40 or Origin 20. Which one would I go for? And are there any sensible upgrades I would do automatically to cure any stock issues? Well, I would first avoid the Origin 20 and any other Origin series because they are terrible, terrible designs, horribly built, with no concept of Ohm's law. They have 2-watt resistors with more than 2 watts across them. I mean, that's an instant fail. And that's, you measure it and you say, there's got this much voltage here, this much voltage here. Let's see, that's going to be this much drop, and here's the value of the resistor, and whoa, no wonder that thing's burning. And the design of the Origin 20 is bad. Where the effects loop is makes very little sense from a design point of view. And the master volume cleans up the amp terribly as you turn it down, which is so easy to avoid. So you have a low volume clean amp and you have a high volume gain amp, and people end up using it like it's a deluxe reverb because they set it clean because they can't turn it up and they just use pedals for everything. There are better clean amps than the Origin series, and there are many better Marshalls. The DSL 40 I've covered in the amps under 500, amps under 1,000 video. They are good choices if you need to cover a lot of bases pretty well. If you need a pretty damn good clean and a pretty damn good crunch and a pretty damn good lead, they will do it if you want tube. They are not exceptionally well built, but neither are they poorly built. They have certain benefits, certainly have benefits over the Origin series, in that they have useful master volumes. The output tube sockets are better built. The only real glaring weakness is that it has a little digital DSP card for the reverb, and the reverb doesn't sound very good, and that DSP card may fail or become obsolete, in which case you have an amp which has a good effects loop but no meh sounding digital reverb, so you just take leave the reverb off. Aside from making sure all the hardware is tight, not anything to really do to it. There's no mods for that amp I'd recommend. If you want something better for not much more, especially if you're interested in a 20-watt amp, look at the Friedman 20-watt amps and the Runt series, and he's got little sisters and all kinds of stuff from about $1,200 used up to $2,000 new. So those are infinitely better than anything Marshall has been making for a long time. But I would consider the DSL 40 a good choice for a lot of players for certain needs at a budget. I would never consider the Origin 20 or 60 to be a worthwhile purchase for anyone. Hey, Mitch the Metalhead. Is there a difference between turning the reverb and or tremolo all the way down on an amp, AC15C1X, and turning them off via a foot switch? Thanks in advance and love the channel. Thanks, Mitch. On the reverb of that amp, what they're doing is they're just muting the reverb that is being fed from the pot to the rest of the circuit. So there's no difference electronically, no significant difference in that amp between having the reverb switched off and the reverb knob just all the way down. On Fenders, it's different because a Fender is muting the input of the tube, which is amplifying the signal coming from the reverb tank. But then the output of that tube, the triode, is still going to the volume, the reverb level pot. So as far as any inherent noise of that tube, even with the grid muted, there can be a little bit of background noise as you have the reverb switched off with your foot switch and you turn the reverb level up. But most people on a Fender are running the reverb between 2 and 4, and you really won't hear that. If you have the reverb up around 8 or so, you would hear a difference between turning the knob down and turning back up to 8 versus keeping it at 8 and switching it off. But it's not major. As far as the tremolo goes, it's going to depend on the circuit. There are amps which usually when you turn off the tremolo with a foot switch, you are turning off the oscillation. the low frequency oscillator, which makes the tremolo do that. But you're not turning off whatever network connects it to the point in the circuit where that oscillation has an effect. In the case of your AC15 C1, that is the output grid leak resistors going to each side of the output section. In your amp's case, turning off that LFO is going to have the same effect as having the tremolo, turning the tremolo intensity all the way off. On Fender, Fenders that use the opto tremolo, like the Deluxe Reverb, the twin reverb, if you turn the oscillation off with a foot switch, then the oscillation stops. If you just turn the tremolo intensity down but leave the oscillation on, it's not that uncommon for those amps to have a tick or some slight sound in the background. And that is curable both by changing the lead dress within the amp or adding a capacitor across the roach, as I've shown a lot of times. But that cure is only necessary because the LFO is still running in those Fenders. So there are other amps out there where the answer is slightly different. In your experience, and not just you, Mitch, but anyone watching this, if you notice a difference between turning the knob down and switching it off, if it's an extreme difference, something's up, take it to a tech. But you may think to yourself, okay, yeah, I hear that I like the sound with the tremolo LFO off, even if it's less convenient for me to use a foot switch. But I know that now, so I will use a foot switch unless it's just a pickup gig that doesn't matter. You need to learn your gear, learn what affects what and what matters to you and what doesn't matter to you. It doesn't matter if the forums tell you this is important. If you're like, doesn't bug me. Buddy with an H, you're being cruel. What is my bigger pet peeve? Lock washers on the outside or uneven knob height? Lock washers on the outside because odds are they've scarred up the panel in the process. It's immensely stupid, but it can actually damage things. Where if they just don't have the knobs the right height, even height, no damage has been done. And I just think less of them as a human being. Capiche? Hello from Jonesboro. Hey, I'm from Jonesboro. Thanks for joining us, Ogsy. This one's a little bit off the path. I used to live on Elm Street, grew up there. Any experience with using different preamp pedals with a single amp to effectively get the associated sounds? Oh, it's tricky. There's a lot of promise out there. What's the best way to approach this? You can use different preamp pedals in the modern sense, where this is, say you had the Universal Audio Dream 65 for a Fender sound and the Ruby for a Vox sound, and you had the Lion for the Marshall sound, and you had or you could use a Tone X, whatever you want, whether some model of a preamp, and you're only modeling the preamp. You weren't modeling. There's no IRs or cab simulations, just the preamp, and you ran that out to the effects loop of an amp with a clean output section. Yeah, it would sound pretty much like a Fender into a clean output section, say a 2x12. Say you're using a Hot Rod DeVille 2x12 as your amp, and you're just running these pedals out into its effects return. The Fender would sound very much like a Fender. The Vox would sound kind of like a Vox, but the speakers would color it a lot. And the Marshall wouldn't really sound much like a Marshall because not only would the speakers be the wrong coloration, the output section is a big part of that sound. Well, I guess you can model the output section a little bit in the pedals, in the preamp pedals these days. They're blurring the line between if it's a preamp or it's a amp model. But in that situation, even with the Lion going to the Hot Rod 2x12, just using it for the power amp and cab, you might notice the difference if your other amp at home is an actual Marshall 50 watt or 100 watt. Typically, the audience wouldn't. The issue there is, well, the audience will never care. The audience will never know. If you know,
if it feels different to you, if you're every time you play it, you're like, I wish I had that other thing. This is not quite it. You're it's not only will you be less satisfied as you play, but you're always going to be aware of that. Every time you hear it, you're going to be thinking about the sound as opposed to what the bassist played or what the drummer's implying, or wow, the singer hit a really cool note there. Let me bring that in here because there's a little bit of a Lydian thing there, and we can explore that. You're not in the creative moment anymore. You're observing yourself rather than just creating. So everything we can do to take ourselves out of the observational mode is good. So if you can get the sound you want without second guessing yourself, that's fantastic. That's an end goal in itself. As far as the Vox in a Box pedals or the Marshall in a Box pedals, or this pedal will make you sound like a Dumble into anything. It's just ridiculous. You can't. Let's see here. I've got a clone. I modded it because the stock clone is way too nasal for me. But that thing's been, referred to everywhere as make your amp in, that's the Dumble sound, right? No, it's not the Dumble sound. I'm not going to do it right now because it's not fair because this mic's here and if I had the Royer hooked up to this thing, I might do it, but I cannot make this 58 Bassman sound like a Dumble if I turn on a clone, or if I turn on the Zen Drive that I built. Though I also modded that because the Zen Drive had some things I didn't like. But if those are the two pedals most commonly marketed to you as Dumbles in a box, they won't sound like a Dumble going into this 58 Bassman. They will sound cool, and it'll be a different thing than Dumble, but, there's a lot of marketing out there. So there's some truth to it, and there's a lot of not so much. But at the end of the day, you can use different preamps, whether it's discrete preamp pedals or different models in the HX Stomp or different models in a Tone X thing, or into the same power section so you can hear it on stage. And you can dial up things that make you happy, that are musical, where you're not second guessing yourself. And if it doesn't sound exactly like a 68 Marshall Super Lead, that's fine. It sounds like what you heard in your head. So whatever creative tool gets you there, that's the real answer. Paul Walker asks, as I am using a Bassman, Fender are releasing the Bassman Tonemaster in the UK in October. Any thoughts compared to the original? All right. What's the best way to put this? That's comparing the rise of Skywalker to Empire Strikes Back. Not only is there no comparison to be made, there's no reason for the newer thing to exist, because it's going to be such an overpriced, short-lived mockery of that company's former greatness. And that's not me being an amp snob. And if for the price that thing's going to cost, you could have a Fractal FM3, maybe even the FM9, and have a much better sounding 58, 59 Bassman sound, as well as about 300 other great sounds. You just need a way to hear it live. You can use in-ears, you could use a full frequency response thing. Hell, you could probably get better results through running that into the effects return of that Blues DeVille 2x12 or Hot Rod DeVille 2x12 I mentioned earlier than you're going to get from that Tonemaster thing. The advantage is the Tonemaster is relatively light, but it's sad to see them be so unaware of what they used to be. Hey, Johnny Moondog, lots of wax on my 73 Princeton. Should I work around components or take it all out and clean the circuit and backer boards to restore? Well, here's the thing. The 73 Princeton is not an extraordinarily valuable amp. So it's not like, he disturbed a solder joint. It just lost $5,000 of its value. And it's not a particularly complicated amp. So while watching a TV show, you could take, if you, as long as you're careful, you know where everything's supposed to go back, you could take everything off the board. And then you've seen it in the videos where I'll take a heat gun. You can use a hairdryer if you don't have a heat gun, and soften the wax on all the resistors and all the caps, and wipe them off with a paper towel, and they'll be shiny and look like new. And then once that's off, get all the old solder off the board, all the old wire off the board. Get all the wax off the top and bottom of the top board and the top and bottom of the bottom board, and put it back together. And you can do this over the course of like 3 or 4 nights while watching TV shows, as long as you're paying enough attention to really put it back right. At the end of that, for time, but not huge amounts of time, and no money other than what the solder and the electrical bill to turn the soldering iron on would cost you, you would have a much better sounding amp that will stay much better sounding for decades to come, and it would look a lot prettier too. So I don't see any downsides to that. But if the amp is otherwise sounding great, but there's just DC in one little area, lift the components up in that area and get the wax off, at least the top of the board in that area. But the trouble is, by 73, the wax was getting really heavy, as you've mentioned. And a lot of times that wax is on the bottom of the board, and you have puddles of wax from eyelet to eyelet, bridging 2 to 4 eyelets all together. And that's where you have bad leakage issues. Glaber P. Sorry, I went southern on you there. How can I tell tubes are bad other than the obvious malfunctioning reasons? I have a Laney VC15, played frequently since I bought it and new in 2010, and still original tubes. Any reason I should replace the tubes? If it sounds good to you, odds are it is good to you. Tubes are going to give you 3 broad categories of beginning to fail. Obvious ones like microphonics or static. If you play and all of a sudden you hear a ringing note and you tap on the tube and it sounds like you're tapping a glass bell, or if there's just, especially if a tube is touched. If the output tubes, especially in a VC15, which is very similar to the AC15 in the output section, if the output tubes are having issues, you're going to hear an increase in hum, because they're not going to be matching to each other very well. So they're not going to cancel out the background noise that's present in that part of the circuit. They have to be matched and all doing pretty much the same amount of current draw for that noise to be canceled out. And the third is the hardest one, is just general weakness, a weakening. And that can sneak up on you. You may not realize that those tubes are getting weak and the output of the amp is getting lower and you're losing some clarity here and there. But that's not as common as the other two. So the good news is, if your tubes are lasting 14 years and you're not having any problems, you turn that amp on and you still smile, your tubes are probably fine. All that said, look at your output tubes in the Laney. You may need a flashlight to see them, because some of the Laneys have got great big panels obstructing things. And look at the print on the tubes. And see if the print has obviously faded or darkened or discolored, or if there's any like brown rings on the inside of the glass on EL84s. That can be a sign of heat damage, and that can be something that you say, all right, those tubes have had a hard life. I may want to go ahead and get some replacements, so that the day that I turn it on and it hums, I can change them out, even if that day has not come yet. That's the best way to monitor it. Other than that, you have to buy a very expensive tube tester, and I can't recommend that to most people. Hey, Garbin, thoughts on gyrators as a replacement for choke? I'm in the process of a DIY project, cloning and combining the Fender Bassman in Marshall 1987 and 2204. Transformers and choke are the most expensive components. I wouldn't mess with a gyrator. I think while the proper 3-ish Henry choke would make you very happy there, you could also say, well, I'll get the choke later and I'll use a 20-watt 1K resistor in the meantime. That will give you a lot of the benefits that you need in terms of that decoupling, and cost about $3. But depending on shipping, I don't know what shipping to the Netherlands is for you, but I imagine you will. I would plan to use a choke, even if you don't use a choke initially, because you can always have, in the meantime, depending on how things are laid out, just a great big 20 watt 1K resistor, which will serve for a while as a choke. That's what I use. I'll use a 10 watt for testing. When I'm testing an amp, I think that it's got a bad choke, I'll disconnect the choke and I'll just put in a big 1K resistor. Now, it may not be the ideal value, but it almost always will work. You can play around with that if you want to, but I wouldn't mess with gyrators or anything. It gets Rube Goldberg at a certain point. You just want to stay simple. Big, high wattage resistor, cheap, reliable, known factor. Choke's better, but if that's an expense you don't want to spend right now, just say, all right, this is a choke I'm going to want to get. This is where the holes will go. This is the size space will take up. I'm going to leave room for that, and I'll come back to it later. Hey, Vinicius. A 65 Deluxe Reverb reissue has a nasty hiss, even with all knobs at minimum on all channels, almost like radio interference, but it's definitely the amp. It's loud, but doesn't get louder with volume increase. Filter caps, maybe? Hiss is rarely filter caps. Could be. First thing you do is pull the phase inverter tube. Does your amp still hiss? All right, well, if your amp still hisses with the phase inverter pulled, something's dreadfully wrong. Odds are the hiss will go away. Swap V3 with V6. Those are the two 12AT7s. V3 is your reverb driver. V6 is your phase inverter. Swap those around. Does the hiss go away? You got a bad AT7 as your phase inverter, because that's going to affect both channels regardless of volumes, in which case you would then have noisy reverb. If the hiss goes away when you pull if the hiss goes away when you pull the PI, but stays no matter which AT is there, you could have two bad ATs, but it's relatively rare. Then pull V4, which is the reverb recovery tube. Does the hiss go away? All right, you got a bad V4 or something in that circuit. Does it not? All right, well then pull V1. That's your normal channel. Does hiss go away? But then you had a bad tube in V1 or something associated with that circuit. You can have a problem in V1B or a problem in V2B, neither of which are going to be affected by the volume because those stages are after the volume pots. You can have a problem in V4 for the same reason. You can have a problem with a phase inverter for the same reason. All those things will affect the entire amp. The channel volumes on your amp are only going to affect serious problems in V1A and V2A. So filter caps are always worth upgrading in a Deluxe Reverb reissue, but it's rarely going to be a cause of nasty hiss. Hey, Skeeter Buck, on my 335, when playing above the 12th fret on the G string, does it sound plinky? All the 335s I've played, that seems to be the case. You mean unamplified or amplified? Amplified, no. Unamplified, if I play really hard, because it is an acoustic guitar, you hear that kind of thing. But I don't have any issues on the 335. I don't even have that issue on this Casino. Same scale length, though it doesn't look it because of where the neck is set, but And that's the cheap one. The 335 is even better voiced up there. Hey, Random Stuff 77, thanks so much. Am I familiar with the 70s Soviet era 6N6C 6V6 tubes purchased from Tube Depot? I am not. I've not asked them to try any. I imagine that they test all their stuff very well. They're a very good vendor. So I imagine they're fine, but I've not tried them. So I need to look into that and see if there's any wiring change that needs to be made. Vinicius says you've checked your valves, but they seem okay. You could have a noisy plate resistor. You could have a noisy mix resistor. I cannot tell you for sure from here, but by checked valves, what do you mean? Because a lot of times those tests I mentioned, especially pulling the phase inverter and then swapping V3 and V6, that reveals a lot in that situation. But if you have V1 and V4 pulled and you still have hiss, it's got to be something in the phase inverter pretty much. It can also be an issue in the reverb mixer. You could have that 10 picofarad cap could be bad. A lot of things it could be, but it's a lot. Most of those things it would be before it's the filter caps, which is what you're asking about first. Anthony Mace just finished a full recap, three-prong chord, black facing 76 silver face 100-watt master volume push-pull twin reverb. Changed out the pile driver speakers for 150 Texas Heat and 90 Alnico Cream. Nice choices. Amp is dead silent, and the owner says it's the best sounding 20 he's ever played. Difficult project. Not a lot of info on the circuit. I'm not arguing with you. I'm not trying to make you sound, but I don't see how that's a difficult project. There doesn't need to be a lot of info on the circuit. Especially if you're changing it to the AV763 circuit. But yeah, some of the push-pull stuff they did, where they'd be using the reverb recovery stage as an alternate gain stage if you did, instead of reverb, that all kind of led to. They were trying to kind of sort of keep up with what Mesa and Dumble and then later Paul Rivera were doing with mods. They just never implemented it very well, even when Paul Rivera was trying to tell them how to do it. But the nice thing about a twin, up until about 82, is any mistake that they made could be undone. You can make it back into a twin reverb. And 76. The push-pull thing, just don't pull it, whatever you do, and the bright cap on those master volumes, snip that bright cap, and the thing sounds $1,000 better instantly. But good job on you, Anthony. I believe you entirely. The thing that it's hard to get people to understand is that for all the weird little flaws of the late 70s Fenders, including the heavy wax board and the glued-in diode baffles that you can't change out very easily, and the baffle frame that velcros and warps and comes off. All that stuff is frustrating. Or the silver panel that kind of flaps because it's only held in place by 2 or 3 things. Despite all that, if you have one that's in good cosmetic shape, you take it to a tech like me, you take it to a tech like Anthony there, and let us make it a good amp for you. You can get those for $800-900 these days. Put $400 or $500 of work from us into it, and at the end of that, for maybe $1,500 tops. That's including tubes if necessary. In this case, Anthony changed out the speakers because those pile drivers were terrible. So less than $2,000, you will have an amp that sounds as good as a 2-rock that would cost $3,000 plus to build new. They're really great starting points. Trouble with the 76 twin, it's very large, very heavy, 100 watts, very, very loud. Master volume on that thing's pretty effective, though. Hey, Shaolin Wolf, trying to decide whether to build an AC-15 or a 1974 head from a kit for classic rock tones with a nice breakup at gig volume. What to expect in terms of clean headroom, tone, etc. Those are both great choices. So is the, is it 2061 Marshall, the other 20-watt Marshall that's out there? Not the 18-watt, but the 20-watt. I was just watching a documentary this morning, and it was... that was the amp that was on the Goodbye Yellow Brick Road album. All those Marshall sounds on that album pretty much were that little 20-watt version. And that makes total sense when you hear the record, because it's, especially when you know how they were tracking that stuff, where it was pretty much live in a room where that had that 20-watt Marshall, and the bass was mostly running through a B15, so that they could hear Elton's piano in the room. All three of those amps, the 20-watt, the 18-watt Marshall, the AC15, would all be great choices for you. And beyond saying that, telling you which one to build, I'd be recommending a girlfriend. So I don't think that's going to be my lot in life, to make such predictions what someone's going to love. You would like any of those three very much. As far as loving them, or I can't tell you. And as far as what to expect in terms of clean headroom and tone and all that, there are a lot of videos showing how those amps sound. I think that the 74 is a cool sound. The AC15, it depends on which AC15 you mean. If you're talking about building a 62 AC15 circuit, it's much more involved, much more complicated tremolo than on the Marshall. If you're talking about doing what people do today, which is making a 15-watt version of the AC30, and just like a normal and top boost channel, that's pretty easy. I think you're going to have to go and listen to as many videos as possible, and try to play them examples of those amps yourself before taking the plunge. So, I think that's all the advice I can give you on that. I think Brad has just joined us, just in time for me to see that we're just to the point where my phone rang. So, as always, I'm well behind, and we're already here at the first time for an intermission. So I'm going to do a 7-minute intermission, and I'll see you all back in a few. coming out of the break a little bit early because I want to get through as many questions as possible. And I was thinking about the question about the 335 and the frets plinky as you go up high. I don't think it's endemic to 335s, but all guitars have a null zone before the truss rod really becomes effective. And the truss rod's really effective from here to about here. And this area, it doesn't really affect that much. And sometimes guitars will the necks will kind of pivot right at that point and have more than one plane that they want to be on. And you can get what's called ramping. And you combine that with the fact that Gibson doesn't always do the world's best fret jobs. Maybe what you're experiencing on the 335s you're trying is that it's not a great fret job. You have one or more frets that are high or low up here. But down here, where the relief is different, that stuff isn't coming into play. But that's not unique to 335s. That's just all guitars in general, and Gibson sometimes in specific. Let's see here. Anthony Calderisi, 97 AC15 TBX. After swapping the tone cut resistor to 56K and making an incredible difference. Would swapping the plate resistors on V1 to 220K from 100K make as much of a difference? Not as much, but it certainly will. I do recommend that. Don't go too crazy with the AC15 TBX mods because it's inherently not worth putting too much into. But the 50, anything from 47 to 68K in place of that 220K for the tone cut makes a huge difference, as you've discovered. And changing the 100K plates to 220K plates makes the amp feel more like a real AC15. It still won't entirely because it's got a plate-driven tone stack versus the cathode follower tone stack of a true AC15 or true AC30, I should say. But there is something you can do. Put a 500 picofarad cap across the cathode resistor, across the 100K plate resistor feeding that tone stack, because they have a plate-driven tone stack. So that's going to be a V2A equivalent. Put a 500 picofarad cap across that 100K plate resistor, and it just slightly warms up the response going to the tone stack. It's subtle, but appreciable. Still doesn't make it feel like a cathode follower, but makes it a little less immediate. And it's really hard to talk about that kind of stuff. It's an easy thing to try. Try for yourself. You can even use alligator clips to do it if you're careful. Remember, there's voltage there. I'm always trying to balance out how much information I give out versus how careful I am to remember that not everyone needs to necessarily have that information. It only takes a little bit of knowledge. John Ratham says, sorry, it's hiss, not hum. I don't recall what that was in reference to, Mr. Ratham. I don't see a previous comment on that. Brad, I hope you got some sleep. Hope you're feeling better. Yeah, I know he's not on an emergency contact list. I don't think. Anyway, I'm sure he's fine. I'm sure just Saturday at 1 he called me. I'll give him a call. Let's see. Any thoughts on the SuperSonic 100 head blonde? I got one thrown in on a deal for free. Not much on the internet about it. There's a reason you paid exactly the right amount for it. Terrible amps. Really, really incredibly noisy reverb circuits. Really incredibly noisy effects loops. Bizarre effects loop integration. Where there's the effects loop send and return, then there's the preamp out and power amp in, which are separate things. And they have the same issues dating back to the Evil Twin from '94, which is to this present day in the Hot Rod series, where they have the low voltage supply that just nukes that part of the board with the Zeners and the 5-watt resistors, and the same bad IC brand filter caps. I really dislike Supersonics. You know, the hot rods, you can fix all that if it hasn't charred the board, and you end up with a pretty good clean channel and a useful effects loop. The Supersonics and the Evil Twins, there's so much else wrong with it that's not worth fixing. It's just, I'm sorry to say that, but I don't take them for work. I worked on one, and I told everyone else who had one, I'm sorry, sell it if you can, get something else. It should have been a class action suit. But then again, it was noisy from day one. They would have been hideously noisy in the store the first day that they were available, and people should have played them and said, wow, that sounds like ass. Next. But no, people bought them because it said Fender. Juicebox Desmond has a Marshall DSL 40C. The clean crunch selector button seems to be the source of a bad rattling sound. It isn't literally rattling, just making an electronic rattling sound. Easy to fix. I imagine that if you were to go in there or have your tech go in there with some deoxit, it's probably the sound. There's a little spring in there. Maybe that switch is malfunctioning. The springs come off of the little plastic mounts for it, and it could be rattling around. But that's an odd description, an electronic rattling sound. That switch is available, and that switch is like $2, so there's probably nothing too major wrong with it. Yeah, the diagonals, Brad, yeah, they do fail. I'm glad that you like your Gens Benz, Jeremy Ross. I had one in, and I was very underwhelmed with the quality of the build. It sounded fine, but it was not built very well. But maybe they got better. Maybe you have a great one. I hope so. I never want anyone to have a bad amp. Hey, Robin. Yeah, welcome to 2024, the search for 6v6s that work in Fender combos. The JJs used to be fantastic. They go microphonic if you look at them twice in a combo now. And the trouble is the Fender reissues tend to have pretty high voltages for other 6v6s on the market. What I've been going to for my clients, depending on availability, are the tongue saw and the Electro-Harmonix 6v6s, and a little bit of fingers crossed involved, and changing the GZ34 5AR4 rectifier tubes to 5U4GB rectifier tubes, which brings down the plate by about 30 volts, makes the tube life easier, brings the plate and the screen down so the tubes aren't being run so far beyond their data sheet max. The sound difference is not that great. There's a difference. You know, you're going B+ throughout the entire amp, you're decreasing headroom a little bit. Of course, a lot of people really will like that. So it is not a transparent change, but short of changing out the power transformers for something else, that's about all we can do. And it's a $35, $40 fix, especially if you can bias it yourself. But Electro-Harmonix and tongue saw are seemingly the best bets right now, depending on the vendor. I suggest always finding a good vendor and having a relationship with them. I like Tube Depot. I also like the Tube Store. Some other people love, Magic Tubes or Euro Tubes. Find a vendor, forge some kind of relationship with them. Not Guitar Center, not Sweetwater, not any of the big box stores, Z-Sounds, certainly not eBay. Unless you own a tube tester and know what all the numbers on the screen mean and all the different switch modes, don't take that chance. Hey, Digital Drew. Hey, yeah, pick up a 2x10. I don't think you can put a 2x10 baffle in the Deluxe Reverb chassis cabinet. I don't think it'll fit. And if it does fit, I don't think you're going to get the full benefits. You really want to have a slightly larger cabinet to to have more internal volume for those 2x10s to really develop the low end that they can. Even the Vibrolux is just barely big enough to have a true fundamental with the 2x10 setup. And it's fairly good amount of cubic internal volume larger than the interior dimensions of a deluxe reverb cab. You would think that, you know, these are all open back cabs, so the dimensions of the cab don't matter. They still matter. They still matter quite a bit. Not as much as if they were closed backs, not as much as if they were, you know, teal ported designs, but even in an open back cab, those dimensions matter. So if you want to, I would suggest finding a really good sounding 2x10 cabinet with really good 2x10s and running your deluxe into it when you want to get that sound. It'd be, or in addition to the 1x12. Hey, Daniel. Yeah, pros and cons of turret boards and eyelet boards from earlier this week. Eyelet boards have the advantage of looking really cool. Did I say eyelet boards? Turret boards have the advantage of looking really cool. Turret boards have the advantage of everything can be on just one side of the board. Turret boards have the advantage that when you solder to a turret, the solder doesn't tend to drip down to the chassis, and therefore you don't have to have a backing board. So you can do very neat work on a turret. You can have some connections from the rear, some connections up top where they're all visible, and you can plan things out so that things which might get changed 5 years from now are mounted on top, and things which are rarely going to get changed are mounted on the bottom. And you can have less strain on components because things aren't going to be making so many right angle turns. You can kind of ease all curves, and you can more readily adhere to mil-spec wiring. Disadvantages of turrets versus eyelets. Eyelets, you can have more components join in one place. They don't have to overlap with each other like they do on a turret. So if you have 5 components going to one eyelet and you change out one component lead, you don't have to undo all the others. You can't really you can't really overheat them typically, whereas you can overheat a turret. You can mostly it's going to affect the phenolic the turret's mounted to. Advantages of the turret is it's easier to put on standoffs. The advantage of an eyelet board is that you can just drill through the 2 fiber boards at once. 3 machine screw, sheet metal screws, and they go right into the chassis the way Fender does it. As far as sonic differences, if it's built correctly, there won't be any, unless you unless you do things with your turret that most people don't do, where you can have everything for the B plus is at this height. Here's the board, here's all the B plus stuff, and here's all the ground stuff. You can build in capacitors, so to speak, by having your grounds and your B plus wires certain distances from each other, running in parallel with each other. Most people don't do that, and the benefits typically aren't great. These are things that are easier to do because you don't have to. Once it's done, it's locked in. PCB has the advantage for that kind of thing. Really, it comes down. Most people, if they're building a Marshall or high watt style, they go turret. If they're building a Fender style, they build eyelet. There's no reason for that other than what it looks like and how it always has been done. It's certainly much easier to prototype on a turret design. Hey, John Rayam. Yeah, there's a chance. There's always a risk of the output, the reverb driver transformer having a problem if it's run with the tank disconnected for very long. The difference being it is essentially an output transformer, and it does not. It's essentially an 8 ohm output transformer, and in theory it needs a load. The difference is that the voltages present and the current present is very small. if I'm doing a long-term playing test of one, I'll either hook up a tank or I'll hook up, I don't have one handy right now, a little RCA dummy plug, the same RCA dummy plug that I'll use to mute, to turn on a vibrato in a super reverb without using the foot switch. I'll put that on the reverb send, so it has a load. If the load is ground, just the same way the shorting jacks are done on the output jacks on that same era Fender. But it is more of a theoretical risk than it is with a true output transformer where you have all that potential current. But yeah, you're right. In a perfect world, every time that I use an amp, or anyone uses an amp which has a reverb driver transformer and it's not connected to a tank, it should have some kind of load in place. I've never had a failure come from that, but theoretically. Oh, sounds great. That's good to know that I can break every rule in how to mic an amp and have it sound good. I don't know how it's going to sound until I hear it, but yeah, I have 57 pointed this way, and the speaker is going that way. That's not exactly what we're going to find any diagrams for, but you never know what's going to sound good. It may just make this room sound good. I'll find out when I hear it back. Hey, Nick, Sarah, you got noise until you pull a V4 in a Vibrolux. You have tube swap, measured voltages, all seems fine. I don't know if you mean working back from the phase inverter or working from the input. If the noise goes away and you pull V4, you have a problem with V4, you have a problem with V2. If you're working backwards on the phase inverter and your noise goes away when you pull V4, then it's in the vibrato channel, but it could be something associated with V2. If you pulled V2 and the noise is still there, and you pull V4 and the noise goes away, then it's definitely V4. It could be one of the small disc caps. I think I just whistled on that S. Sorry. Typically, noise in V4 is coming from the junction of the V2B coupling cap, which is a 20 nanofarad, and the 500 picofarad cap, which is going to the V3, the reverb send, and which is also running through a wire over to the 3.3 meg resistor, which has a 10 picofarad across it. And you can usually measure DC voltage at either of those two eyelets. You can measure it at the eyelet where the 20 and the 500 picofarad join, or you can measure the same point electronically where the 3.3 meg and the 10 picofarad are going diagonally. And that is usually caused by leakage from the adjacent B plus node. You've got those two. If you're looking at the board, I'm trying to do it from YouTube's perspective. If you're looking at the board, you have the two 100K resistors like this. And on this side, there's the 100K going off to the plate, to the tone stack. That's the slope resistor. But on this side, you've got, for the 200Ks, you've got a 20 nanofarad cap, and then you've got a 500 picofarad cap. And then over here, there's a diagonal 3.3 meg, and there's a wire from there to there. That's the point where you're going to have that noise coming in as DC, and it's because right here where this junction is, the B plus here, it's only about a 1/4 inch away, and any moisture in that board just goes from this eyelet to this eyelet. So all of a sudden you have 300 millivolts to 3 volts. I've measured as much as 12 volts on that junction of the two caps, and that's a very common cause of noise in these amps. And the fix I've shown is you remove all the components, at least where they join at that eyelet and the resistors where they join there. Get all the components out, get the old solder out, soak that area of the board in isopropyl alcohol, at least 90% pure, if not 100, and soak it. Take the screws off hold the board against the backing board, get some air beneath the main board, and then use a heat gun and really heat up that area. Evaporates water. The ISO will push the water out as it goes, and then heat up the eyelets with your iron, which will drive out any remaining moisture, and then put everything back. Most of the time, that cures it. But if it's unlikely to be a small disc cap, if if you do need to change them, I like the 562R series from Vichy that they carry at Mauser. I think they have them at DigiKey as well. Vichy 562R, 1 kilovolt. Hey, Sonny Silversmith. He says, I think you mentioned one time that you can get a JTM Marshall sound by changing the V1 in the Fender Bassman Tweed reissue. I have a 1993. Well, one of the only real circuit difference that matters between a JTM 45 and a 59, 58, 60 Bassman circuit, in as far as gain goes, is the fact that Marshall used a 12AX7 for V1, and Fender used a 12AY7 for V1, so that AY has a lot less gain. I'd show you now because I actually have the 58 here, but with this setup, it would blow out the mic pre. We'll be showing that in the last videos that we do on this amp, going between a 12AY and an AX. It's a tremendous difference in gain. There are other differences, primarily the tone stack differences, where the Marshall used the 2222 in tone stack that you see in the Fender schematic, whereas Fender actually used 22 and 100. So the low end reaction is different. The presence circuit is done differently. The negative feedback's a little bit different, and the tail and cathode section of the phase inverter is done differently. Because Fender changed things in production and Marshall just copied the original Fender circuit schematic. And Fender had Schumachers, Marshall used, Drakes and Dagnalls and whatever, actually radio spares at that time, and Marshall used, what's it called, why did my numbers go away? Fender had 6L6s, and Marshall used the big British equivalent, which is a different 6, which it's there every time I reach for it, except when I'm talking to people live. So Marshall used different iron, and Marshall used the tubes that were available in England at the time. Other than that, the JTM 45 is a copy of the Fender Bassman. Later, they started to tweak different bright caps and the mixers and stuff, and it nudged it farther away from the Bassman, more towards what became the Marshall 50 watt. You get the whole Black Flag era where they were trying a bunch of different stuff. But as far as, hey, it sounds like a Bassman, hey, it sounds like a Marshall, that 12AX7 versus the 12AY7 is a huge part of that. And I'm sure, I don't have, today I forgot to turn on the screen where I can see the live chat. I'm sure people were screaming at me what that tube type is, that I just spacing at 6 something. Great big thing. KT66s, sorry. Damn it, Lyle. Not KT66s, is that right? I can't think. I have a peculiar relationship with numbers and letters. I remember words, I don't remember abbreviations. Hey, Louis Sherwin, thank you very much. I think it's allpcb.com would be a great place to go. It's overseas, but the delivery is cheap and fast, and they do a good job. And if you have the Gerber files, you can spec out everything and preview it. It's pretty simple to do. But I think it's all PCB. Eric says Eastman guitars are a good alternative. I have an Eastman acoustic, which I think is fine. The electrics, aesthetically, there's always something about the electrics aesthetics that they've changed that I don't care for. The headstock shape, the body shape, the pearloid binding, they're really, really good guitars, but they don't speak to me the way Gibsons do. But that's wholly subjective, the aesthetics for me. The Eastman electrics are amazing, especially at any price. They're really damn good guitars. They're better guitars than Gibson has built consistently in a long, long time. Hey, BC Electronics, 2 WGS ET65s should make you smile. Now, it is not the perfect speaker for every sound, but it is a speaker that I test almost every amp through. If an amp sounds bad through that, that amp's still got a problem. Once an amp sounds good through that, it may sound even better through something else, or more in a nudge in a particular direction for a particular player's preference, which is surprisingly hard to say. Much harder to say than I thought it was when I started that sentence. But I've never heard anyone play ET65s and go, "What the hell is that?" They all go, "Ooh," because all of a sudden they can hear what their amp is actually doing. Thanks, Rob F. I appreciate that. When it comes to lead dress, the SG is a smarter guitar than the Les Paul because the pickup wiring switch of the SG doesn't need the extra wiring jump to the other side of the strings. Agreed? Well, yeah, it's a lot shorter path, and it's certainly easier for a tech to connect everything up. The only disadvantage to the SG switch is on the SGs with the Vibrolux, which mine has, is that because if you're trying to use the arm, it's hard to get to that switch. It's hard to get to the knobs, especially the tone for the neck pickup. My solution is I rarely use the Vibrolux on that. I like the way it counterweights the guitar so it doesn't neck dive, and it looks cool, and it has I think the SG with the Maestro Vibrolux sounds better than the stop tailpiece version. Subjective, but yeah, just as from a player's point of view, same thing for a 335 or a Casino. I like having that switch right here. My hand goes down here for all the controls. When I have a Les Paul, I always go down here and I'm like, oh no, it's up here. Go down here, no, it's up here. When I get a Les Paul, I always spend about 2 weeks before my lizard brain remembers to go up here for the switch. That said, there are guys out there who play Les Pauls all the time, and they would keep going like that when they meant to go like that. So we all got to train our lizard brains. Now that sounds like a Wall of Voodoo song that never was. Hey, Jeff Free 69, 66 Blackface Vibro Champ. What do you think about adding another node to the filters, i.e. another 20 microfarad element and 1K resistor in front of the 3 caps already there? It's not a bad idea, but you would probably want to separate the ground and the positive from the rest. And there are articles about this that I don't have links for in front of me right now, but it is a good way of adding more filtering without adding more capacitance. And just that adding that extra stage where both the hot and the negative are decoupled from the next stage really can work wonders, especially in a single-ended amp like a Champ or a Vibro Champ. I'm trying to remember if Merlin has information on that at valvewizard.co.uk. If not, I bet Brad, if he's not off blowing his nose forever, if he's still in the chat, he might have some links for that. But that kind of virtual node, let's call it that, can be more effective than adding an actual sequential node. Hey, Eric, I don't have any opinion of the Bassman 20 circa 82 to 83, other than to say that 82 to 83 was the beginning of a dark, dark time for Fender amps. I have no experience with the Bassman 20, but I just had a Twin 2 that I turned away, and most of those 82 through 87, 88 amps, I decline whenever possible because there's so much wrong with them. Sorry. Hey, Cole, have I worked on a Marshall Club and Country, and what are my thoughts of the amp? I have, but I'm trying to remember. The Club and Country is one of those tricky ones where the same circuit was used in about 5 different amps with 5 different model names depending on what speakers it came with, or whether it was a combo or a head or one of the giant things that they were doing at the time. It was good. It was a late '70s Marshall. They're all built pretty much the same. It's just slight variations on what's going on with them. Speakers make such a difference in which one of those amps sounds like what. I have no issue with a Club and Country. I think I've had one in though, and it's been quite a while. Just one of those models that was never very popular in the United States, as far as I can tell. I think they were more common in Canada. Certainly, a certain Toronto-based band liked them very much. Okay, Johnny Moondog. Sorry, Johnny. I was trying to, for whatever reason, like you said, the first part got lost. His 66 330 sounds great, but it's unusable on stage due to its incredible ability to pick up radio and switching noise. Any way to improve that without damaging vintage value? Not really. It's really, really hard to shield any hollow body guitar. You can do it to an extent. But even if every wire is perfectly shielded, at the point where they're connecting to the pots, there's exposed without any shield, so it's open to interference there. There's no Faraday cage the way you can get in a guitar with a cavity that you can access, and you can fully shield all the walls of the cavity. You could have a hollow body guitar built where they shield it before they put it all the way together for you, but it's just not done. And the 330 with the P90s is especially going to be prone to that because the pickups are so prone to picking up everything from the environment anyway, and they can be microphonic. I would say that keep your 66 for the studio and home, and if you want to have that sound live, pick up a Casino or another 330 and have some frail and noiseless pickups put in it, or go to a different kind of guitar which is going to have the ability to be shielded. Maybe this is the world telling you also need a Les Paul Special or Junior. You can shield that, still have P90s, and it's a different voice, which would augment your 330 for use in a studio or at home, but live would not have any of those issues. But anything that could be done to yours beyond making sure all your let me say this: yours may have a bad solder joint or a bad ground connection somewhere in there. You may be one wire being reconnected away from a much better sound, unless a tech had your guitar and could look through the F-holes with some mirrors and some lights. I can't tell you from here, but a lot of old guitars have been in poor operating condition for 30 years, and no one who owns it realizes that. They don't have to be as noisy as they usually are, especially on ES series guitars where the tone caps can be real stressed as the pots can rotate. So don't give up hope based on what I said, but also don't expect it to ever be as quiet as it is possible to make a guitar for live use. Hey, Michael. He's working on a Silverface Twin. Does the installation thickness of internal wires matter? He's in Germany, can only find... I don't see... Okay, here we go. Can only find H05V K-spec wires V and A. Okay, if the voltage and all that matches, if it's rated for X voltage and X current but has thin insulation, that's fine. I don't remember what Brad's using, but there is wire out there with very thin insulation. The Teflon coated stuff, the PTFE coated stuff can be very, very thin and very, very effective. Let's see, I've got... This is some stuff I like to use from Tube Depot. Let's see.
This is 20 gauge, Teflon coated, stranded, silver tinned. I think it's rated for 1,000 volts, and it is really thin. You know, it is half the diameter, easily half the diameter of traditional 22 gauge wire used either like a Marshall top coat or certainly the Fender cloth covered stuff. And this stuff, there's aside from things like in heater current, it's where I'd use an 18 gauge versus this mere 20 gauge. There's nothing in any amp this side of an SVT where this would not suffice. I could probably use the 22 for almost everything in there, but I like the 20 because if I bend it, it stays where I bend it, as opposed to the 22, which is just so floppy enough it doesn't want to stay in a bend. So when I'm working on, especially when I'm working on an old Vox, I love this stuff because I can make the wire go up and bend in just a certain way and come down and bend another way. Not the right angle stuff you see people do on the gear page. It would probably take a right angle just fine, but I just don't want it to be, I don't want my gentle bends to be just floppy loops. I want them to kind of curve in a known way and then kind of stay there. And this has enough mechanical rigidity to do that, but it's really small. You can't hurt it with a soldering iron. And, you know, if I were to, I could replace all the really thick 18 gauge heater wire with this stuff in an amp, and people would say, whoa, looks like it'll catch on fire for the concerns that you had. But it won't. It just won't. I love that stuff. So I think as long as, as long as you know the criteria of what you need and the wire meets that need, the thickness does not matter. Thando 4 needs a combo that will mix well with the 92 Blues DeVille 4x10. Is looking at a 64 concert 4x10, but given the cost to maintain, should I get just another Blues DeVille 96 Lone Star Strat 77 LP? You should not get another Blues DeVille. Blues DeVilles tend not to last. They last better than the Hot Rod series, but they don't last very long. I think you're going to have a higher cost to maintain two Blues DeVilles than you would with almost anything else. But 4x10s are expensive from the get-go. For whatever reason, good sounding 10-inch speakers are expensive, and you have to have 4 of them. So you have almost twice as the expense of a 2x12. I would suggest that if you already have a 4x10 that you like the sound of, try a 2x12. Try 1x15. I think if you like the sound of that 4x10, you already have that. I don't think that things need to match identically to be useful. I think that you're going to get more benefit probably from a slightly different sound, whether it's putting together in a mix or making a stereo spread if you're one of the stereo guys out there. But I'm getting into the subjective at this point. I can't recommend a specific 4x10 combo for you, other than to say you need a 1962 concert or a 1958 Bassman. You know, I just think the Blues DeVille is, if yours has been working since 92, you've been very, very lucky. And I would not tempt fate anymore with more of that stuff. Hey, Ed, thank you so much. No, I have had no experience with Lil Dog amps. The spelling makes me want to dislike them, but that's unfair. But I have no experience with them. Hey, Tanya, I do not, when you said, what's up, Guru, I thought you must be talking to someone else in the chat. I cannot be called Guru. I cannot, that's flattering, but a bad headspace for me to be in ever. What do I think about the Tone King Falcon Grande? Thank you. I don't have any opinion of that amp because I have no experience of that amp. Tone King, the stuff that Mark Bartel built is phenomenal.
The stuff that's being made today, I have high hopes for, but I've not experienced very many of them. The ones I have had experience with have ranged from the very, very good to the problematic, but they stood behind their products, so I don't want to criticize them unduly. I would be cautious approaching Tone King, but I would not be pessimistic, if that makes sense. I think it's well worth investigating, but I don't have any negative or positive experience to relate with that Falcon Grande. So I hope it's fantastic, but I cannot tell you. But thank you. Hey, Strum Bum. I'm glad you enjoyed those videos. Yeah, it's surprising to me how popular those parts ordering videos have been. It's inherently a very dry, boring process, but it's so crucial to being able to do this. And I think it's something that most people aren't aware of, the stuff that we have to do behind the scenes. You know, Brad was talking about this on his stream in between sneezes yesterday, that you get an amp or any electronics device in, and if there's something unusual about it, especially if it's been out of production for a while and the documentation is non-existent, you may have to say, well, there's no schematic for this, and you spend 2 hours reading up on it, and you realize that, oh, someone said in 1982 that this model is really rare, but it uses the same main circuit board as this other model, and you find the other model schematic, and you track that down, and you finally find one that's not a Xerox of a Xerox of a Xerox or a Xerox, and then you can make sense of what's on your board, and then you have to go through and say, all right, this is what was printed for this other model, and the board layout of what I have is the same, but just because they use the same board doesn't mean they populated it the same way. So you got to go through there and measure and say, okay, yeah, well, this 100K is 100K, but oh, they use an 8.2K here, but they use a 12K here. You know, I don't want to go too far down there. There's a lot of stuff behind the scenes that we have to do, that we have to charge for, and it's really hard to justify if people don't know that. I went and ordered all the parts for your amp. It looks like that you just said, hey, world, I need all the parts for a 62 concert. And the world said, here you go, push this one giant red button. So, but yeah, Mauser's fantastic, but has a daunting search system. And like I said before, and I will say again, and I said to them on the phone the other day, their phone browser, their phone website is abhorrent. Do not use, do not even attempt to use it. It is painfully useless. It used to be that nonsense would come up, and at the bottom you could say load desktop site. You click on that, and you could have a usable website on your phone. But no, you have to use a real computer to make Mauser work. So, and that includes iPads. You have to have a computer. Sorry, rant over. Hey, Bottom Kitchen. Do I know if the Weber Alnico Silver Bell sounds like the original Celestion Silver Bell T1088? I've read that modern speakers are louder than the vintage, and that they're based on. Let me say something. May seem contradictory. Weber speakers can be fantastic. Weber speakers can have issues. I used to get nothing but fantastic speakers from Weber when Ted was running the show. Ted has sadly passed. I have had some speakers from Weber that have not been fantastic or lived very long, but CJ, I think is his name, who's running the show now, they had very good support, and they took care of it. And I've the past couple ones I've gotten from them have been uniformly great. So from my perspective, it seems, I'm not saying this is a fact, it seems like after Ted departed, sadly, there were some problems in production, and maybe they have sorted them all out. So I have a qualified recommendation of Weber based on my experience in the past and my most recent experience, but I've had some speakers from them that have been duds that have lasted about a week. They took care of them, they replaced them, so they're not slamming them, and it looks like they have worked that out. That said, When they are good, they are very, very good. And the Silver Bell is one of my favorite speakers I've ever used, and I really like the Weber Silver Bell. Does it sound like a 65-year-old Celestion? No. And that 65-year-old Celestion doesn't sound like it did when it was new. And it is very rare to hear 3 Celestion silver speakers from 1965 that sound like each other. They all have a similar kind of thing, but they have distinct differences. And I don't know how different they would have sounded when they were all new. So it is not realistic to expect a new pair of Silver Bells to sound like a vintage pair. Buy a new pair, then put 60 years of playing into them, they might. But they might sound very different because the originals are inconsistent. And the blue and the silver, I have read conflicting information about whether it's the same thing and they just changed the paint color, or whether they changed the cones, or if so, when, and does the cone change correlate to the paint change? I don't know. They're hen's teeth. I'm arguing about the hen's teeth that I've personally experienced. And I've experienced more than most people in North America, I think, at this point. Not all, but most. There is a... People are like, the Vox sound. It's not. It's the Vox spectrum of sound. And the speakers are a big part of that being a spectrum rather than a thing. So if you are interested in the sound for Voxes and Voxy style amps, for the Voxy ladies, the Silver Bell is fantastic. And you combine one Silver Bell and one Blue Dog, that is a great sounding combination. They pair well in the room, and you can bring out different characteristics by which one you mic, or which, if mics on both, which fader comes up more. Or you can just go two Silver Bells because they're beautiful. Yeah, Jeremy, talking about the 1N5408 diodes. They handle 3 amps, but they only handle X number of volts, and it's the voltage, not just the current, because there are voltage spikes in a rectifier. And as all diodes are cheap, the 5408s are a quarter each versus 4 cents each for 4007. If you have an opportunity to use a couple of them in series, there's no downside to that. Hue, I don't recall if that's R37. It's 52 and 51 on the current ones. I don't remember if it's 37. It's in all the Blues Juniors, current and, all the fixed bias Blues Juniors, from the early ones to the current ones, they have a 33K and a 24K. Sometimes it's a 33K and a 22K in series with each other, making a voltage divider. And this is one of the 15. This is like the 15 volt supply, and this is ground. And here they have a cap across the lower one, and that junction that makes a voltage divider at that junction that feeds the bias. And so, if you have 33K and 24K, and you put 68K across the 33, it pushes it down close to 24, and raises that voltage up so it's less negative. And that's the fix. So you find that pair of resistors making that divider on the schematic for the Blues Junior you have. That's where you adjust it. But I don't have the part numbers in my head. I have the circuit in my head. And it can vary between 68K and 82K, depending on how much you need to come down, because you're putting in parallel across the existing 33K resistor. If you need to pull the board for whatever reason, it's better just to take out that 33K and put in a 24K, or whatever gets you to where you want to be. I don't think it's worthwhile putting in an adjustable trim pot. I've seen people do it, and I've done it once or twice. Set it and forget it. Get it to a safe range. Aim for about 55% idle dissipation with 120 volts coming out of the wall. The amp will sound great. It'll last a long time, and you've not spent a lot of time in parts on a Blues Junior. Because no matter what you do to a Blues Junior, eventually the output board will cook itself. And there's just, Hey, John Williamson. Yeah, the UF series are quieter in the RF noise range, but UF versus a one in doesn't really matter at all in a guitar amp. I've tried that, and it's really not a thing. And people love the Freds for various reasons on forums that don't seem to correlate into real life. But I'm not arguing with you. I don't think you would take that as an argument. But yeah, in theory, the UF is a better choice, and I have often ordered UFs just to avoid that argument with people, because when you buy in bulk, they're like a fraction of a penny more than a one in, and then I can just put in something that very few people will argue with, but there's not any real benefit to it in this context. DB, I have no insight on the Friedman Vox amp because I have no knowledge of what the amp is going to be, when it will arrive, or what Dave is doing. I have every confidence Dave will make a good sounding Vox-esque amp. I do not know when. He's going to be pulling a rabbit out of a hat. I don't know which hat. I don't know which rabbit, but I expect it will work. Unlike that thing with the girl in the box. That was terrible, Dave. That was a really bad idea. The saw really should have been sharper. Anyway, have I seen the D-Lab video where he opens the Weber and CE can caps? Weber had Nishikon and the Chinese cap, and CE cap looked like a real cap. Weber had Nishikon and Chinese cap, and CE seems like a real can cap. I don't pay attention to the D-Lab. I've had one of his amps in, and it was unsafe to sell to humans. It was garbage. Absolute garbage. Nishikons are incredibly high quality capacitors, and CE can caps do seem like a real can cap, but they have a high failure rate with no good specs. If I knew that Weber's consistently had Nishikons in them, I would use them. But I have not had any consistency in that regard from Weber, and certainly had not had any consistency in the quality caps used by Hasey at Hamfest. So all of them are iffy choices. And I've been talking with Brad about maybe collaborating on a good solution for all the Champs and Princetons out there, where we don't have to use anything of questionable design. But that's for another time. Hey, I'm not singling anyone out, but I'm seeing the same question being asked multiple times. Remember that I try to order these answer these in the order that they're asked. So if you ask a question and I don't answer it, wait, I'll get there. But when I see the same question more than once, there's a lot of question marks that could be flying at me any one time. I don't want to miss people's questions. I go back and look at other streams and I've missed people's questions and I feel bad, because I don't mean to. Hey, Seth, could I discuss what happens to the guitar signal as it goes from pedal to pedal, and how buffers fit in the equation? Maybe even try to quantify. Thanks. Yeah. All right. Let's see. This kind of thing I would prefer to have a prepared set of charts or graphics for. Let me show you something first. This will take just a second. Turn off this amp. All right, this is the little board that you've been hearing. We'll talk about this board in some other video. It's very nice. I made it myself. It's very quiet. It's very flexible. It does a lot of things. But you'll notice that here's the HX Stomp. And in the stock one, if you press on this for 2 seconds, the tuner comes up. I've actually got it on this little thing here, because I want to have more things here, and this is my tap tempo and tuner for that. Why then do I have a tuner here? I've got a Polytune 3 Mini. in addition to this being a more accurate tuner than the one built into here, this has a very high quality buffer in it. And when I first ran this, and I would plug in, I first got the HX stomp, and I plug into the input of the stomp, I come out of the output, everything seemed okay. But if you hit these two buttons and do analog bypass, and turns everything off, or you plug in and come out and the thing's off, the sound was much darker. It was like, not just like rolling the tone knob down on your guitar, but rolling the tone knob down on your guitar and rolling the volume down on the guitar a little bit. And that's because this thing has a relay bypass system, but at the same time the input is split off, is going in one direction to some DSP stuff, digital converters and stuff that lets this thing work as a DI. You can always send the dry input out to whatever recording device you're using over USB, which is a cool thing, but that means that the signal at the input is split off to that stuff, even when it's not being used, and then to the output jack through a relay. So you can either go through all the stuff in here, or it can go straight to the output jack. But even when it's bypassed through the analog bypass and it's going just to the output jack, it's always being sent off, split off to the stuff that would allow it to work as a DI out from digital, which means that it puts a load on a passive pickup. The pickup cannot do that. It's like, imagine being at the fair where you have that thing with a hammer and you hit it and the bell goes up, and if the bell rings, you're a real man, right? Well, or I could have gone with Sisyphus pushing a rock up the hill. This is enough of a weight that the signal coming out of the guitar cannot push it up. It can't ring that bell. And so it's trying to go in two directions at once, and it gets weak as a result. I know this is a gross oversimplification, but it makes sense. As soon as I added the Polytune 3 buffer, and there could be lots of good quality buffers on the market, not the one built into the Klon circuit. That's a terrible buffer. Don't let people sell you that buffer. But the buffer in here is quite good, and you can buy it standalone, but for not much more, you get a really good tuner built into it. Once that happens, then there is no difference in sound between going into here and running through these pedals off and then going to the insert loop and going to the amp versus going in through here in analog out mode. Because all of a sudden, the signal coming out of the Polytune is not affected by this load. And the signal coming out of this Polytune can smash that hammer and the bell flies off and everyone thinks, wow, he's a real man. What it's doing is once the guitar hits the input of this, and on this board, the guitar comes in here, comes out of here into here. So that's all it is. So it's just going through this interface box into this. I didn't want to have the input be this because it'd be up in the air. It'd be easy for me to snap off. This way it's down by the ground. So the guitar only sees the 1 meg input impedance of this tuner. So it's just like the input impedance of an amplifier. And the guitar doesn't see anything after that. It's not affected by anything after that. So your pickups aren't loaded down by anything after that. And so the puny little signal from the guitar comes in here and it's happy. It's gone. It's hit the hammer as hard as it can and it rang a tiny bell. And then this magnifies that hammer and rings all the rest of the bells. And I could drive 100 feet from this and you wouldn't hear any difference between plugging straight into the amp pretty much. Micro difference. Kind of less of a difference than where you picked one note versus where you picked another. If I had charts and graphs, I could be more. I'd give you maybe a better understood answer and certainly more accurate from a scientific point of view. Nothing I said there was misleading or deeply flawed, but I was having to do kind of analogies, and I ended up with like the circus somehow. Anyway, my teeth is floating. We're going to take another 7-minute break, and then I'll try to go faster when I come back and get to some questions. Try to answer as many questions as possible. I don't always get through all the questions or get to all the questions, and I apologize for that. But we only have 3 hours. It occurs to me, I'm coming back a little bit early so I can get to some more of those questions. It occurs to me that I probably should have said something very clever like, you can either get really strong and hit that hammer harder, or you can just hit it more efficiently. You know, like Tiger Woods is not hitting that ball that much harder than I could because of strength. I'm probably as strong as Tiger Woods. But he hits it so much more efficiently because he's hit that ball so many more times. I've never played golf in my life. Because it's golf, it'd be boring. But, you know, my analogy was not perfect. But maybe we'll do a video on that someday. Of all the various tube reverb circuits amp manufacturers used over the years, which one's my favorite, both from a tone and design approach? Matt, I really like the Ampeg one because you can psych it out into doing the same thing that you can do poorly with the Silvertone, where you can have nothing but wet and you just play the wet and it sounds like a 60s horror movie or sci-fi if you turn on the tremolo too. But from a general perspective, the best one so far, I think to this day, has been the Fender. And while the standalone tank with the dwell on the tone can do all kinds of cool stuff, I think a well-functioning example in the stock Fender reverb amp from the 60s is just perfection for a internal reverb. I prefer adding things in post. You know, give me a good plate reverb, maybe an echo chamber, even some big hall things to play around with after the fact. Let's see. Hey, buddy with an H. On output 2 bias tremolo like a Princeton, the negative bias is fed through the intensity pot. Is it possible to lose bias? And if so, what's failsafe? Yes, it is. Put a 2.2 meg resistor from wiper to lug 1. So from the bias to the wiper, you have a 2.2 meg resistor. And so if that pot were to fail, there would always be a bias reference through that 2.2 meg resistor. The amp wouldn't sound very good with that because the bias would be thrown off, but it would basically be cold. You would have a bias reference. You know, that's the failsafe for that. The other failsafe is to make sure that you have everything in the bias supply as good as possible. There's no such thing as a true failsafe in any of this. You could always have a freak thing where a diode fails in the bias supply, but you're less likely to have that if the one from 1964 has been replaced with the new one N4007 or UF4007 if you want to satisfy the gear page. That was not aimed at you, John Williamson. But yeah, a 2.2 meg across the from the bias to the wiper will take care of most issues in Princeton's and similar tube bias tremolos. Strum bum, I don't know if I will. It wouldn't be a turret board. It would be a PCB. It would be a drop-in PCB. I would not be converting it to hand-wired. It'd be converting it to a good turret board, good PCB. I don't know whether I'm going to do that because I don't want to invest a lot of time and money into that and then have Fender shut me down because they can afford attorneys more than I can. B, I am not set up to do support for that. I cannot spend all my time on the phone or email telling people how to use the thing. It'd be use at your own risk kind of thing, and that's its own barrel of monkeys that I probably need to avoid. It's something that I might make available, but I'm not sure that the cons might outweigh the pros. I might make one available to me and to a few other techs that I know because I wouldn't have to hold their damn hands. But it'd be nice to have, hey, here's a drop-in thing. It fixes all the problems easily and no big changes necessary. But it would not be a hand-wired thing because there's no benefit to hand-wired. There's just no benefit to it. Good PCB is better than good hand wiring. That's a hill I will die on, but the amp won't. Hey, Matt Mayhem, the CC was a good amp, but the C is better. It's confusingly named. The current Custom series is better than the old Custom Classic series. The only advantage of the Custom Classic is that they had an effects loop that more easily went between two different levels, between line and pedal, instrument and line. But they had a mistake in most of the ones made where they had a 0.22 cap on the send versus a 2.2 as they should. And so most of the CCs out there, you turn on the effects loop, you lose a lot of low end. That's an easy fix, and I've shown that in lots of videos. But is there a better AC30 with master volume? Yes, absolutely. The custom series is better than the custom classic series. Eric, if your 73 has no wax, that's great. You got lucky, but they started to wax the hell out of the boards in 73. You might have had a leftover board. Let's see. My preferred method for cleaning flux off of boards components without smearing it all around. Well, there is spray specifically for that, but you want to typically use it outdoors or in a place with a lot of ventilation because it has got some nasties in it. The other solution is really pure isopropyl and a toothbrush, soft bristle brush. That will do it, but it really takes the full purity stuff. You can't use the 90% for that. But the spray-on stuff does a good job, but it'll often leave a haze. Electronically, there's a difference between being clean and being pretty. So something can be electronically clean, electronically not prone to any failure, but visually, there's going to be a bit of a haze to it. All depends on how much time you want to spend with a brush to make it perfect to the people who won't see it because it's inside a box. I want everything that I work on to be spotless and perfect and to have no little anything. But sometimes I have to remind myself that I'm the last person who's going to see that for 15 years and that it doesn't have, you don't have to be able to see yourself in a PCB. I have no thoughts on the Orange Amps tube tester. If I were to buy a tube tester, it would be a maxi matcher. It would not be anything from Orange. I don't use mega insulation testers. Jatuka, I don't have a need. I have my own means of testing things, but I've not needed to buy gear for that. Thank you, Alex 2112. I'm sorry, I'm trying to go through fast here. The Korean casino specifically, if I said it wasn't as good as the current one, part of it's build quality. The build quality has definitely improved on the more recent ones, though not enough. Though the Korean ones tended to have rosewood versus the Chinese having this Indian laurel. But the main problem for me is I want the sunburst version, and the sunburst on the Korean versions was done stupidly, with the sides being sunbursted and the back being sunbursted, and the whole thing looks clownish compared to a real one. On the new ones, they've got the sunburst done the way it was done on the old ones in the 60s, and I think just in terms of visual satisfaction, it makes a huge difference. But yeah, the Korean was not a particularly good guitar other than that either. Imagine designing an amp for the world market. You can do the maths and step up. Yeah. How would I emulate the frequency difference without spending thousands? In terms of 50 hertz versus 60 hertz? Well, you can spec out a 50 hertz transformer. You can spec out a 60 hertz transformer. Or you can make compromises. And some compromises have no quality deficit, and others do. So I would try to do it in such a way that if any compromises need to be made to use a universal transformer, that I knew that it would run in proper temperature spec at 50 hertz and 60 hertz, and that the heater would stay in the desired range specified by me at all voltages and frequencies, and that if, hey, the amp had a little bit higher B plus but was still within an acceptable range at 240 versus 230, that I would know all these factors. But that would probably mean that I would have to actually test these things, and that's one of the ways that some multinational companies today just don't seem to get it. But I have not tried them yet, Tinker Cave Dweller. I don't buy anything from Tube Amp Doctor. They're in Germany. It's a very expensive distributor for me to buy from, but they're not the only source of the double mica JJs. I just haven't tried them yet. I will soon. I will report back, probably in a video. And I'll be trying the 6N6C, which is hard to say. Thank you, Gooden, for that. At least I was close enough to make it recognizable. Alex, yeah, do not plug an amp with a two-prong cord into a wall and try to use it. You're going to be at risk of killing yourself. When you have a two-prong cable, especially on the old amps where you can plug it either way because there's no larger neutral connection than there is than on the hot, you have 50-50 chance of plugging it in the wrong way, and then you can have 120 volts potential from chassis to ground, which means you to ground when you're touching the strings of the guitar. And that potential is there, whether it's going to realize itself in just a bare trickle where you think, hey, that feels weird, or whether you die. It's kind of up in the air depending on the age of all the other components in that old Montgomery Ward. So yeah, you need to have that changed out. It'd be irresponsible for me to say anything other than that is unsafe. That is a health risk. Don't do it. And there's no benefit to the old cord. Aside from the fact that you're much less likely to die, amps are quieter, much quieter in terms of noise when the chassis is a shield. The chassis will not be a shield unless it is grounded. What is the inexpensive replacement speaker of my choice? It depends on the amp and the wattage necessary. I don't like open-ended questions too much like that. So if you told me a specific amp, I could help you. But the inexpensive replacement speaker for a Champ is not at all the right thing for a Marshall 100 watt. Built an Buddy with H built an 5F2A pre with a long tail pel push pull output. Sounds fantastic, but too much gain past 2 o'clock. Options to test. Voltage divider directly before or after volume. Via cathode, just put a voltage divider after the volume. Or if you want to, you can just put a resistor in front of the volume pot. So you can limit the gain by making it, it's already a voltage divider. You just shift it down by putting like a 220K resistor in front of the volume pot. There are a lot of ways to do it. I would say, all right, this is Doc it hurts when I do this. So if it, up to 2 o'clock sounds great and above 2 o'clock sounds bad to you, turn the volume to 2 o'clock. Measure what that is. If say it's a 1 meg pot, say if you got 500K and 500K, whatever it is at 2 o'clock there, depending on whether you use linear or audio. Say, all right, well then what happens if I make that the lower number 1 meg? What ratio do I need to increase the top one by? So if you had 500 and 500 and that's where it sounded good on the pot, and it's a 1 meg pot, you put a 1 meg in front of it. If it was 250 and 500, you just do the same thing. So you scale that. That'd be the easiest way to do it. Or you can just do a double 470K voltage divider after it, and you're probably going to end up about the same place just from experience. But play around with the simpler ways to do it without making any big changes to the rest of the circuit. Cathode resistors, unless you can calculate load lines, that's not a place to play around with such things. Hey, Rob Keeler, have a look at a design, wonder if it's genius and I'm missing something or just bad engineering. In all modesty, no. Genius is pretty freaking obvious, and bad design just jumps out at you like Times Square signs. Just Danger Will Robinson, Danger Will Robinson. There are times when I've overlooked a subtly wonderful thing, but it's never like, oh, that won't matter or anything. It's more like, oh, what he's doing with that. That's a weird little network. And I'll trace out an amp, and there'll be like a mystery section with say a local negative feedback thing, or it doesn't even have to be that local. It can be from later in the amp back towards the input. I'll be like, all right, I will trace out everything else and then look at that. And so I just kind of put a blinder on for that. And sometimes when I go back and look at that, I'm like, oh, that's really clever. I see why they're doing that and why that's only affecting X frequencies. At other times, I'm like, oh yeah, they just, this was a blanket solution, and this was the absolutely wrong way to do it because it introduces all these other faults. But I'm not trying to say it because I am uniquely smart at this. I am, in modesty, quite good at this. But there's only so many ways to skin a triode, and most of them have been done. And so it's like what it's like going to Taco Bell. They have 7 ingredients and 30 different things on the menu. Which combination of the same 7 ingredients is in this amp? Not all amps are like that, but you know, and it's nice when they come in and it's like, hey, it's a Supreme. They added sour cream. Let's see. Hey, Daniel, that's really odd. You changed out the C-Rex for an Alnico Blue, and the reverb circuit is feeding back now. That's really unusual. Tried in every orientations. All right, well, it's got to be just something about the speaker which is exciting that tank. It's got, I want you to try 2 things. I want you to take the tank out of the back of the amp. I know it's a pain in the butt. And set it on, to take the screws holding the cable to the side, take the bag out, and put it on the floor behind the amp, or put it on a pillow behind the amp. Does it still feed back? You can also try like a 2.2 nanofarad cap from the return to ground. That's mostly going to be the high frequency stuff. It may just be that the tank that you have is really prone to that, and the frequencies that blue produces excites that. But electronically, that should not be happening. But acoustically, electromechanically, it can be pretty obvious what the cause and fix is, but I'd have to have the amp in front of me. It could just be a matter of dampening the tank with different weights or thicknesses of foam. Hey, Jerry White. Yeah, I prefer nitro, mostly for the same reason you're talking about, because every time I've had a poly guitar that gets knocked around, I get a little chip, and it's like broken glass. In terms of sound, it depends on the thickness, but a well-applied, relatively thin poly, whether that's polyurethane or polypropylene or polyester, can sound just as good as a nitro, and nitro can be of no benefit. But nitro is certainly prettier when you do get wear and tear. I used to have the made in Japan Strats and Tellys from the late 80s and early 90s that are worth thousands of dollars now. To my mind, they're still $400 guitars. And every time you get a chip in one of those, you find out the finish was that thick and just be like this crater of like radiating shards of glass. It's not the cool look that we wanted. Acoustically, debatable. Aesthetically, nitro, when it dings purty. Hey, Adam, you got a 71 and a 73 Vibrolux. Those models didn't change that much. The Vibroluxes and the Deluxes didn't change that much compared to the 60s, especially early in the 70s. I think that they might have changed the 10K droppers to 2.7K and 10K in that era. It's really not that important. You're going to have a little more headroom, which is a good thing. The 5U4GB versus the GZ34, which is usually going to be a good thing, again, with the wall voltages today. The only real change that they might have made is you might have some snubber caps on the grids of your 6V6s, 6L6s, and you might have a snubber cap, that 2.2 nanofarad I mentioned, on the reverb recovery. And those were usually added in the early 70s because they had so much excess wire. That was the beginning of the spaghetti era, 1970 really. And so if you have all that excess wire, you can have oscillation. Rather than clean up their lead dress, which would require training their employees better and making their employees work slower, therefore making fewer amps per day, they just added those caps to deal with the inevitable noise and oscillation. So if you go in there and shorten all the wires to the bare minimum while still having a little bit slack so they're not under tension, you can end up removing 2-3 feet worth of little 1/4 inch to 1 inch snippets of wire from one of those things, at which point everything is laid out neatly like it was in 64, 65, and you can remove those snubber caps without any issue. But the Vibroluxes in general didn't change much between 64 and 74. So wax is an issue, especially on the 73, and the baffle is an issue. By 72, they were gluing and dadoing in the baffle rather than screwing it in, which is only a problem if the baffle becomes loose or becomes damaged, especially with the speakers. But other than that, you're pretty close to perfect as you are. 71, 73 Vibrolux would be certainly, if someone wants a great Fender, that would be one of my first fairly affordable recommendations, because it's just a almost do everything amp, and in certain ways sounds like half of a Super Reverb. Let's see. What's the wildest fix I've seen on an amp? He had someone bring in a tube reverb burning through tubes, and previous owner cut a hole in the chassis, mounted a fan to cool them off. Yeah, I've seen stuff like that. Thanks you there, Daniel Crescenzo. I just saw that super chat, and I'll get to DIJ in just a second. Speaking of which, I think the weirdest fix I've seen was where someone had decided that every tube would sound better if it were gooped. So every tube socket, they put the tube in and they put caulk, not even silicone, but like kitchen bath caulk between the tube and the ring of the bayonet mount of the tube shield, and of course it squeezed out. And then they did the same thing on the output tube on the bear trap. So had to remove and replace every socket and tube in the amp to get all that nonsense out. Because you know what? Surprisingly, kitchen and bath caulk is not rated for many hundreds of Celsius degrees, which is what they experience in a tube amp. So it smelled really interesting. I've seen worse things done, but that was I guess the wildest fix. No kind of fix at all. Hey, KWGM, thanks for watching me intermittently, and thank you for subscribing to be here. I appreciate that. I always speak of something. Thank you very much. What I said about 70s amp is true for the guitars, to a degree. To a degree. What we just said about weirdly chipping poly finishes can be true. I hate the change they made to the Telecaster body shape. This is one of the most beautiful curves found in the natural world. What they did here is just a thing of beauty and a joy until the early 70s, when they changed this area right here for no good reason and made it ugly. That's really hard to undo. And the 3-bolt. I don't need to go on about the 3-bolt and why it's completely inferior in every way. I understand what they were trying to do, but the 3-bolt can be replaced with one of these fairly easily. It's that curve that they ruined starting, what, 73, 74? Might have been 72. I can forgive the weirdly cracking poly finishes and all that, but it's really hard to forgive making one of the prettiest guitars ever designed ugly for no damn good reason. My channel, my soapbox, right? Hey there, DIJ, thank you very much. Thank you very much, sir. That's very kind of you. I have mentioned using multiple parallel film sorry, I can't not talk today. I have mentioned using multiple paralleled film capacitors instead of a single electrolytic for audio coupling. Technical reason for this. Number 2, any experience or information concerning Worth electronic electrolytic caps. I'll take the second one first because it's brief. They're great, they're available, and they're red. I have no problems with Worth. Many times I don't use them because they are not available in every value and every temperature rating and every lifespan rate, at least published lifespan rating that I want for a project. And I like all the caps in any amp to match. So I will typically do all Nishikons or all Panasonics. But sometimes I'll realize, hey, I could use Worths for all these, and then we'll have red caps. And that's worth it sometimes. Just I know that they're good. They're fine. The temperature, the blah blah blah, all the specs are fine, and they're available, and they cost about the same, and they're red. Red's good, but sometimes the black and gray Panasonic and Nishikons are the better way to go because there's a value that I need that Worth doesn't offer that they do, and then I'll just make them all Panasonics or I'll make them all Nishikon. Number 1. I have mentioned using multiple paralleled film caps instead of a single electrolytic. When you're passing audio through it, electrolytic caps have a sound. Film caps can be much more transparent. Trouble is, film caps have it's really hard to find small, inexpensive, large value film caps. Pretty much, especially in a pedal. So there are places where I would have, say, 2.2 microfarad 63 volt film caps, which are fairly large caps from Wemo or Epco or whoever, in a guitar pedal, where other guitar circuits might have used a 10 microfarad electrolytic. And when you do this for the entire thing, when everything in the audio path is film versus electrolytic, it feels different. There are people who are going to be rolling their eyes at that. It feels less like there's a box there. It feels less like you're playing through a box, more like your amp just sounds that way all of a sudden. When you step on this button, your amp sounds like that now, as opposed to I'm stepping on this box, the boxy sound. And I've got the Klon build and the Zendrive build here. And I don't love either of them, even after I modded them. I'm using the boards from Aeon Effects, which are quite good, and they're this accurate. You know, they are the original circuit, well built on PCB. And no disrespect to the guy at Aeon, he used electrolytics where the originals used electrolytics, where Klon used electrolytics. You know, where Hermida used electrolytics. I prefer the sound of film, and where it's feasible, I will use that. But to get enough capacitance before a resistor to ground, we have I know the impedance there. I know what the preceding stage is capable of driving. I know how the RC filter is going to work, so that I want to know where my high pass point is, and I know what the impedance driving the next stage needs to be. So within all those variables, I may use 4.4 of film with a certain amount of resistance to ground, whereas the similar circuit would have used a 4.7 microfarad or a 10 microfarad with a slightly different resistance to ground, because it was one part and a smaller part and a cheaper part. Most things in pedals are chosen because they are cheap. And in the pedals that I used to build, I would say, well, yeah, that's the cheapest way to do it, but is it the best? And I would try it. And I had everything set up, the same board built twice. One all film, one all electrolytic. Every other component being like 1%, rated metal film, as close to identical as possible, aside from the capacitors. And I heard, and I felt, and I measured a difference. Was it huge? No. Was it noticeable? I felt so. Second thing, every time you put an electrolytic in a circuit, 10, 15 years from there, that's going to need to be changed. That film cap, unlikely to. So that was the other compelling reason. I'm like, okay, I built a pedal which had 3 electrolytics, and there were all 3 of them in the power supply, easy to access. Whereas to build the same thing using all electrolytics would have had like 10 because it had multiple op amps, so it needed to be decoupled. That's a lot of caps to be changed every 20 years versus 3 all in one place, easily accessed. So it's not something many pedal people do. But I noticed that Wampler does it quite a bit too. So I'm not the only crazy person out there. I missed Aluids. Ooh. Champ of the Radio Shack L-Pad. Yikes. Thanks, Jeremy Ross, for being here. I appreciate that. I'm not a legend. Brad's a legend. That's an Australian thing. Do I normally recommend stock pots on the Princeton Reverb and Deluxe Reverb circuits? Strumbum, I do. If you mean by stock pots, I mean the pots that Leo spec'd out in the AB763 schematic, which the reissues actually use. The main difference is that the volume and treble pots in those circuits are J taper, 30% taper, not 10%. A taper is 10%, L linear is 50%, and J taper is 30%. That can be as low as 20 to 30%. Pots have a tolerance. I think the Fenders are nominally 35%, but the what's in the reissues. That makes a huge difference whether you have audio taper, J taper, or linear taper, B taper, on a treble pot especially. So yeah, I like the stock pots. The only place where I would change that, if you get a chance, on the Reverb, I like an audio taper 100K better than the linear taper 100K. That way, instead of having everything that you want to use between 2 and 4, everything that you want to use is between 2 and 5, 2 and 6. A lot bigger sweet spot for dialing the reverb on a Fender than just below 3 is too little, just above 3 is too much. I think most of us have been there. And that's just because they use a linear taper pot for that instead of audio. Merrill, we are not quite in the end times for vacuum tubes, but at some point the digital stuff is going to get so much better, and the tube stuff is going to get that so much more esoteric that it's going to be like I'm wearing a mechanical watch here. It's a Seiko. It's not a very expensive watch. It's not cheap, but it's not Rolex. There are those who see this and say, well, why would you need that? You can just do it on your iPhone. It's hard to answer that question as getting to the point with tube amps versus modeling. Not all modeling, but especially the most recent fractal updates, and to an extent the Tone X stuff, that we'll talk about that at another time. We're going to get to the point where why would you want to have an amp when you can just do it on your phone? Well, it's been a long time that we've been able to tell time on our phones very accurately, and yet there is a huge market for Rolex. There's a huge market for Seiko. There's a huge market for Omega, and there's a huge market for cheap Casios. But these are pretty much enthusiasts. It's much easier to justify a $50 Casio than it is to justify a $10,000 Rolex, yet they keep selling those damn Rolexes. So I think we may get to a point where the majority of people have a device, whether it's on their phone, whether it's on their pedal board, that does all that. There are going to be aficionados who really want the real deal. And the sad thing is that I think a lot of great musicians will never get to experience what the real deal feels like, because while the Tone X can sound just like certain things that real amps do, there are all the other things that you might have discovered, other sounds you as a good player might have discovered if you'd had the real amp there versus just playing someone's moment in time capture of what someone else set the amp to. Someone else owned the amp, someone else set the amp, and you're playing in that sandbox, but you don't know all the other options you might have had. I'm straying into a different area than I meant to. We're not at the end yet, but I think it's going to eventually get to be sadly a rich person's game, or maybe it was my hope that it'll be an anarcho-punk movement rejecting all the digital stuff and going back to to the core stuff? We'll find out. Hey, Joe, I am doing very well. Joe's got a 5-watt custom amp, a 112X7, a 6V6, and a GZ30, GZ34. It doesn't break up at all. Any advice? Yeah, get an overdrive pedal. You're describing a tweed champ. They don't have enough gain to break up on their own. You know, you've got a preamp tube stage, and then one more tube stage, and then the output. That's all you get. It's not going to break up. You get hints at it. That's it. You have a recipe for a very clean amp. But the world is full of $50 used overdrive and distortion pedals. You can get any sound you want. What's my opinion of people stuffing modern caps into old casing to retain the authentic look? I think it's ridiculous. I think it's just ridiculous. First of all, there's the danger that of someone passing off one of those things as original, because there's, for some crazy reason, there is an intrinsic value to the original part among certain collector mentalities, and then it could be disguised. Second of all, there's disguising the fact that it's been changed. If it's an old cardboard tube, do you know what part was used? Was it done well? Did they use a generic? Did they use a Nishikon? Did they use how old is it? What's the rating on it? It's hard to see, especially if they've filled it in with epoxy. You can't see if it's leaking or not. And it takes away the pride of workmanship. You know, hey, I'm disguising everything I did to make it look like it's still original, but you can't see if I did a good job or not. And then there's just what Leo would have thought of that. Leo would have rolled his damn eyes out the door on that. It's ridiculous. It's a spark plug. You know, maybe it's a bad analogy. You can't really see a spark plug when it's installed. I don't know what the right analogy is, but I don't know. It'd be like painting white walls on a sports tire. It's painting white walls on a Pirelli. Let's call it that. I think it's a ridiculous thing, and I think anyone who worries about that should probably spend more time practicing. Will series of parallel wiring have differing functional or tonal effects on speakers besides the change in impedance, DC resistance? All things being equal, no. You won't hear any difference. Some people claim to. I don't buy that. I've done the tests and I've not found any differences. There are differences in terms of reliability, but that's primarily whether you have, say, 2 4-ohms in series to make 8 or 2 16s in parallel to make 8. The 2 16s in parallel to make 8 are going to be, that's going to be a more reliable rig. But once you get into the 4x12, so long as 2 of the speakers can handle the wattage of the entire output of the amp, you don't really have safety issues. It gets complicated. But parallel is superior in redundancy and reliability if other factors are taken into account. In terms of the sound, there's someone arguing that they can hear the difference. I don't believe it. I've not heard any difference, and I have tested that out of curiosity. Hey, Andros, I've not tried any old EROs. I'm sure that they're fine. There's not like there is a life expectancy, but its life expectancy exceeds mine. So, I don't think I'm going to be around by the time those caps start to age the way like an old Astron would. Enjoy them. They're probably absolutely fine. No problem, John Ram. I'm glad to have been of help. Let's see. KT66s. That's how far back I am. Let me see if I can go fast. Let's see. To fix ticking tremolo in a 64 Deluxe Reverb, don't lift the ground leg of the 100K resistor on the trim speed pot. No. If you fix a ticking tremolo, you put a 10 nanofarad cap across the roach. You can see that in several videos of mine. No, you don't need to move the ground of the resistor. That's not the fix. Look at I can't remember. I don't remember which video what was that I last showed that. I'll be showing it again on the Super Reverb videos coming later this week. But they're very simple fixes, and you don't have to change the ground, especially on a 64 Deluxe Reverb. The stock 64 Deluxe Reverb ground scheme is just about perfect. Sorry to be vague. I'm trying to get to as many other questions as I can. And I'm skipping a few. The Panda asking about Haybor versus Hammond. I answered a similar question earlier. My preference is Haybor, but there's nothing wrong with Hammond. Let's see. What is better, Marvel or DC? Please explain why. Marvel, Superman sucks. Spider-Man is the way to go, man. Spider-Man he could get hurt if your protagonist never has any serious struggles or never is in any real jeopardy, and is not relatable at all. Then it's just some boring Ubermensch kind of guy. Spider-Man, he could have his leg broken, he could have his heart broken. No experience with solid-state 70s Sears amps, Vern Brown, sorry. Let's see. All right, not a guru. Noisy Verb, I can't talk. Vibrato channel on a 69 Super Reverb. Pull V4, it's gone. Noise increase with the volume. Okay. No DC on board. Normal and VB input coax. Well, change out the 69. The wire is weird. Change out the insulated, shielded wire going from the input jack and the volume pots to each V1 and V2. That cable gets rotten. I know it sounds weird, but yeah, I've had noisy, really noisy shielded cables in those things. Start there. Even if that's not the cause, it's not good cable, and you will have other benefits from doing that. 6L6s, I like the tongue saw SDRs a lot, Nixera. Let's see. Tim Jones had a Fender Greta. They ran into a 1x12 but found it wild and like a toddler having a tantrum. I assume this is going to be normal. Love the videos. Thank you. I don't know why you would have wild sounds running into a 1x12 versus the stock. It'd be weird for an external speaker to cause oscillation. I assume you're describing oscillation, but the Fender Gretas are terrible designs, and I'm sorry that you had one. Let's see. All right, so talk about the pedal board when I showed that. A little cluttered and busy, kind of sloppy, just the way we like it, Richard. How many volts on a Fender eyelet board are acceptable? In terms of the safety of the entire board, I wouldn't exceed 700 volts at one of the B+ nodes on that material. As far as what you're measuring at a place that's not supposed to have any DC in what you're measuring, anything over 15 millivolts is cause for suspicion in my book, and from 30 up, you're going to start hearing noise. Let's see. Hey, Adam Shaw, can I offer guidance on grounding points for power and audio? For example, between input-output jacks, 9-volt DC input jacks, and the enclosure, should they be separate, and how? Talking about in a pedal? In a pedal, in theory, you only want one connection between the chassis and signal, and you want that to be at the input jack, and all other connections to be separate from the enclosure and steered. So in theory, you would want to have either your input jack be the only jack which is tied to chassis, and that's your chassis connection for the entire circuit, and all other jacks, audio jacks, to be insulated from the chassis. Or you can have all jacks insulated from the chassis and run a wire to the chassis ground from the input, and have the DC reference to that same chassis connection, or have the DC reference to the ground right there at that input jack. Or you can do what I have most often see, which is where you have, say, switchcraft metal jacks for input and output, and then everything referenced to the ground on the input jack, and no ground wire run to the output jack because it's already getting its ground reference through the chassis. That's acceptable, but not perfect. What you don't want to do is have input and output jacks both grounded to chassis and have a ground wire going to them, because then even if you don't get an audible hum, you've created a great big noise antenna and you'll have a noisy thing. That's especially an issue with a wah, where you can pick up radio stations very easily because they have that configuration. And the fix for that is to replace the output jack with like a Neutrik or Cliff jack, or drill out the chassis a lot and put in a insulated washer for a switchcraft long bushing. And then you have the chassis only going to circuit ground at the input, and then a steered ground to the output, but you don't have a path from the shell from the input to the output, especially two paths. As far as more questions about that, it's a long subject, and as I don't currently build pedals, it'd be hard for me to show you. Let's see here. I'm trying to make sure I'm not missing anything. All right, let's see. It's not really worth it replacing the output transformer with a custom classic with a Hammond, unless because there's not one that there's not a direct fit made for that amp on the custom classic or the custom or the hand wired. All the replacement ones, aside from Mercury, are made for the old original JMIs, and those mounted to two different planes of a chassis at once. They mounted to an L, so some are going here, some are going here. Unless the output transformer of an AC30 Custom Classic is faulty, don't worry about it. And I did the VVR before the choke, but I no longer do the VVR because no matter what you do, the heat issues cause problems down the line, and it would need to be the kind of thing where every 6 months the whole VVR circuit were changed out, or you need to have like 5 MOSFETs in parallel with each other with massive heat sinks. It's not a trustworthy long-term solution, and I've stopped doing it for that reason. I need to update the website. Deluxe Reverb from a kit builder, 65 reissue, Fred asks. Depends on who's building the kit. In general, the answer is 65 reissue because most people don't build kits well, including people selling you amps with brands as if it's an actual amp company when it's really someone making kits poorly. Randomly selected user, any significant difference between solid core and stranded hookup wire? Yeah. Solid core is much less reliable because they have stress and vibration, and you only have to have one thing go disconnect and it loses it, whereas most stranded there's not going to be as rigid, there's not going to be as much mechanical stress, vibrational stress, and if one wire were to break, you still have 99 others. I try not to use solid wire unless I'm rebuilding a vintage Fender where that was what was done. I much prefer stranded. I think we're just over 3 hours. I'm going to have to wrap this up. Major Dude, I don't have time to go over all the steps checking out a vintage amp, but I've got videos where I have shown amps that people have just bought and had me check out for them. So depending on what amp you're looking at, if it's a Fender, I've got my vintage Fender playlist. If it's a Marshall, pretty much anytime you see an amp part one on my videos, it's part one is usually looking at what it is and seeing what work it needs to be done. And the same thing goes for inspecting amps when bought. Do I have a favorite 5-way super switch wiring for dual humbuckers? The same Tones Make Bones, the same circuit I published for the P90s will work for the humbuckers. I didn't include any coils tapping. You would want to do coils tapping or splitting using a push-pull tone pot probably. So if you must do that, you can incorporate the coil tapping stuff as found on the PRS. Or you can do the standard Duncan stuff. I think it always sounds better to do bridge series parallel than a bridge split. But that's a deep subject. But the schematic that I published for the 5-way wiring for P90s for the RevStar will also work perfectly with all the same values with the humbucker. You just won't have the ability to split coils with that. That would be a separate configuration, and there's one or two poles of that super switch I did not use where you could probably build someone in. Yeah, I have a ET65 and a Veteran 30 in my shop cab here, Dan Brockman. So they have heard a lot. I have no interest in Super amulets. Will not be taking. Thank you very much, Jimby. I appreciate that. The Supros I've had in have been so depressing that I will not take any more in. They're just bad. Can conductive fiberboard cause a background white noise hiss? Absolutely. Absolutely. Leaky DC is not anyone's friend. $50 for a JMF Spectre T30 amp. Cameron, I have no idea what a JMF Spectre amp is, but I'd be cautious of any amp which costs less than 2 of the tubes in it, Cameron. Sorry. Let's see. I think we're going to have to wrap this up. I'm sorry. I know there's going to be a lot of stuff I don't get to, but we're already over the 3 hours I set up for this. Do I have a PayPal tip jar I can donate to? Strumbum? No, I've got it set up. You can do the super chats here, and then on the regular videos, there's a thanks where you can do a tip or whatever you want to do on one of those videos. And I'm going to be setting up a Patreon, but I've not set up a PayPal tip jar. It's just so hard to keep track of all these things because all these things, they're taxed. And so if I have 1 or 2 sources for that I've got to keep track of and report, it's much easier than if I have 6 or 7. Maybe I should be looking after every dime possible, but when you do that, you also need every accountant possible. All right, so yeah, I will be checking all the stuff here that I'm missing afterwards. We're about to wrap it up. Yeah, gold bars. I love gold. All right, let me click on the little thing I have called Begin to Sign Off, and that's what I'll be doing. Hey, everyone, thanks for putting up with me on a Saturday. Hope you're having a good time in the world, and I hope you enjoy this kind of thing. And thanks very much to everyone for joining me. See ya.